Would you do if the people who should love you most sold you like livestock, just because you couldn't have children? This is Elara's story, but not everything is what it seems. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The cold autumn wind swept across the barren fields of northern England, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The sky hung low and gray, a thick blanket of clouds that seemed to press down upon the small village of Thornmere like an unwelcome burden. It was a dreary afternoon, the kind that made even the hardiest of souls seek warmth by the hearth. Yet Elara found herself standing outside the modest cottage that had been her home for all 22 years of her life, her fingers trembling, not from the chill but from the weight of what was about to happen. She wore a simple dress of rough-spun wool, dyed a faded brown that had seen too many washings in the nearby stream. The fabric hung loosely on her slender frame, for there had been little food in recent months, and what little they had went first to her father and 2 younger brothers. Her long chestnut hair, usually braided and pinned beneath a worn linen cap, now hung loose around her shoulders, tangled by the wind. Despite the hardship etched into every aspect of her appearance, there was an undeniable beauty to Elara's features. High cheekbones that caught the dim light, large hazel eyes that held both intelligence and sorrow, and full lips that trembled now as she fought back tears. Inside the cottage, she could hear her mother's voice, sharp and bitter, as it had been for the past 3 years. 3 years since the village healer had confirmed what everyone had whispered behind closed doors, that Elara was barren, unable to bear children. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs and work the land, this pronouncement had been a death sentence of sorts. The young men who had once smiled at her in the village square now looked away. The mothers who had considered her as a potential daughter-in-law now steered their sons toward other girls, girls whose wombs were presumed fertile and whose futures seemed bright with the promise of sons. "You've been nothing but a burden." Her mother's voice carried through the thin wooden door, each word a knife to Elara's heart. 3 extra mouths to feed is too many, especially when one of them is useless. At least your brothers can work the fields and carry on the family name. What can you do? Nothing. You're worth nothing. Elara's father, Thomas, said nothing in response. He had been a strong man once, broad-shouldered and capable, but years of poor harvests and mounting debts to the local lord had broken something inside him. Now he sat by the fire most days, staring into the flames with empty eyes, letting his wife make the decisions that should have been his to make. Elara had tried not to blame him, tried to remember the father who had once lifted her onto his shoulders and called her his little songbird, but that man seemed as distant now as the warm summers of her childhood. The cottage door creaked open, and her mother emerged, wrapped in a threadbare cloak that did little to protect her from the wind. Margaret was a hard woman, made harder by circumstance, her face lined with years of worry and resentment. She had been beautiful once, or so the older villagers said, but Elara could see no trace of that beauty now in the pinched mouth and narrowed eyes that regarded her with such cold calculation. "He'll be here soon," Margaret said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Lord Caspian's steward sent word this morning. 20 silver coins. That's what we'll get for you. 20 coins to settle our debts and keep food on the table through winter." "Mother, please," Elara whispered, her voice breaking. "There must be another way. I can work harder. You can do nothing," Margaret interrupted, her tone sharp as a whip. "We've already discussed this. The decision is made. Lord Caspian needs servants for his manor house, and the steward says he pays well for healthy young women. You should be grateful we found anyone willing to take you at all, considering your condition." Elara wanted to protest, wanted to scream that this wasn't right, that selling your own daughter like livestock was a sin against God and nature. But she had learned long ago that her wants meant nothing, that her voice carried no weight in this house or in this world. So she simply nodded, wrapping her thin arms around herself and trying to stop the shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. The sound of hoofbeats on the muddy road drew their attention. 3 riders approached, their horses fine beasts that spoke of wealth and status far beyond anything the villagers of Thornmere could imagine. The lead rider wore a heavy cloak of deep burgundy wool trimmed with fox fur, the hood pulled low over his face. His companions were clearly guards, armed with swords and wearing leather armor beneath their traveling cloaks. They radiated an air of casual menace that made the few villagers who had gathered to watch step back instinctively. The lead rider dismounted with practiced ease, his movements fluid and controlled, despite the bulk of his winter clothing. He stood tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that suggested strength and power. When he pushed back his hood, Elara found herself staring at a face that seemed carved from stone. Strong jaw shadowed with dark stubble, a straight nose that had clearly been broken at least once, and eyes of such a deep blue they appeared almost black in the gray afternoon light. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and fell to his shoulders in waves that suggested he cared little for courtly fashion. There was something fierce about him, something that reminded Elara of the wolves that sometimes came down from the northern forests in winter, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. "You are Thomas of Thornmere?" he asked, his voice deep and measured, carrying an accent that marked him as educated, perhaps even noble-born, though that seemed unlikely for a steward. Thomas had emerged from the cottage, wringing his hands nervously. "Aye, my lord. Sir. I am Rowan, steward to Lord Caspian." The man interrupted smoothly. "I understand you have a daughter you wish to place in service at the manor." "Yes, sir. That's her there." Thomas gestured weakly toward Elara, unable to meet her eyes. "Strong girl. Hard worker. She'll serve well." Rowan's gaze shifted to Elara, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. Those dark blue eyes traveled over her face, her form, assessing her with the same attention one might give to a horse at market. She lifted her chin, refusing to cower despite the fear that churned in her stomach. If she was to be sold like chattel, she would at least maintain her dignity. Something flickered in Rowan's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or was it respect? It was gone so quickly that Elara couldn't be sure she'd seen it at all. "She appears healthy enough," Rowan said, turning back to Thomas, "though I was told she has certain limitations. The price reflects this, you understand." Margaret stepped forward, her voice eager. "The healer said she's strong as an ox otherwise. She can cook, clean, sew. She'll earn her keep, I promise you that." "I'm sure she will," Rowan replied, though his tone suggested something else entirely, something Elara couldn't quite interpret. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small cloth bag that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. 20 silver pieces, as agreed. Thomas took the bag with shaking hands, weighing it briefly before tucking it into his tunic. The transaction was complete. Elara had been sold, her worth measured and paid in cold silver. She felt something break inside her then, some last vestige of hope that this was all a terrible dream from which she might wake. "Get your things," Margaret said brusquely. "Don't keep the Lord's steward waiting." "I have nothing to get," Elara replied quietly. Everything she owned she already wore. The dress, the thin cloak draped over her shoulders, the worn leather shoes on her feet. She owned no jewelry, no keepsakes, nothing of value that might have been worth bringing to her new life. Rowan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded once, sharply. "Come then. We have a long ride ahead, and I'd prefer to reach the manor before nightfall." One of the guards brought forward a fourth horse, a gentle-looking mare with a patient eye. Rowan moved to help Elara mount, and she felt the strength in his hands as he lifted her easily into the saddle. His touch was impersonal but not unkind, and for some reason that small mercy made her throat tighten with unshed tears. "Wait," Thomas called out suddenly, and for a moment Elara's heart leaped with desperate hope. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps some remnant of the father she remembered still lived inside the broken man by the cottage door. But Thomas simply handed her a small cloth bundle. "Some bread and cheese for the journey. It's not much, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to look at her. Elara took the bundle, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that she forgave him, that she understood the impossible choices poverty forced upon people. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded and clutched the bundle to her chest. Margaret said nothing, her face set in hard lines as she watched Rowan mount his own horse. There would be no tearful goodbye, no last embrace or blessing. Her mother had made her feelings clear. Elara was a problem solved, a burden lifted, nothing more. "Move out," Rowan commanded, and the small party began to ride away from the only home Elara had ever known. She didn't look back. There was nothing there for her now, No reason to remember the cottage where she had been born, where she had learned to walk and talk and dream of a future that would never be hers. The village of Thornmere grew smaller behind them, swallowed by the gray mist that rolled in from the distant hills. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the muddy road and the whisper of wind through the bare trees that lined their path. Elara's mind raced with questions and fears. What would her life be like at Lord Caspian's manor? What would be expected of her? Would the other servants treat her with kindness, or would they learn of her condition and shun her as the villagers had done? And what of this Rowan, who rode ahead of her with such easy confidence? He seemed different from what she had imagined a steward would be. Harder, more dangerous somehow. The way he sat his horse, the casual way he wore his sword, these were not the habits of a man who spent his days managing accounts and overseeing servants. Yet, who was she to question? She was nothing now, property purchased with silver coins, her opinions and observations worth less than the mud on her shoes. The landscape changed as they rode, the flat fields giving way to rolling hills covered in ancient forest. Oak and ash towered above them, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the leaden sky. A light rain began to fall, cold droplets that soaked through Elara's thin cloak and made her shiver. She tried to hide her discomfort, tried to sit straight in the saddle as if she rode fine horses every day, but her inexperience must have been obvious to anyone who cared to look. "Are you cold?" Rowan's voice startled her, and she looked up to find him watching her with those intense blue eyes. He had fallen back to ride beside her, leaving the two guards to lead the way. "I'm fine, my lord," Elara replied automatically, though her teeth had begun to chatter slightly. "I'm not a lord," Rowan said, something almost like amusement coloring his tone. "Just a steward, as I said, and you're a terrible liar." Before she could protest, he had unfastened his own cloak and leaned across the space between their horses to drape it over her shoulders. The heavy wool was warm from his body heat, and it smelled of leather and pine and something else she couldn't quite identify, something masculine and oddly comforting. "I can't take your cloak," Elara protested weakly. "You'll freeze. I've ridden in far worse weather than this wearing far less," Rowan replied. "Keep it. We still have several hours of travel ahead, and I'd prefer not to deliver you to the manor with a fever." Elara pulled the cloak tighter around herself, grateful for its warmth, despite her confusion at this unexpected kindness. In her experience, men of status did not concern themselves with the comfort of servants, especially newly purchased ones. Perhaps Rowan was simply protecting Lord Caspian's investment, ensuring the goods arrived in acceptable condition. Yes, that must be it. Still, the gesture touched something in her that had been numb for so long she had forgotten it could feel at all. "Thank you," she murmured, and thought she saw him nod, though the rain had grown heavier and it was hard to see clearly. They rode on through the afternoon, the light fading as the sun sank lower behind the cloud cover. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing close on either side of the road. Elara had heard stories of bandits who lived in these woods, desperate men who preyed on travelers, but the presence of the armed guards seemed to discourage any potential threats. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes followed their progress through the deepening gloom. Just as she was beginning to wonder if they would be forced to make camp for the night, the trees fell away, and Elara caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. Lord Caspian's manor rose before them on a low hill, a massive structure of gray stone that seemed to grow out of the very earth itself. Unlike the crumbling fortifications of the old lords, this was a well-maintained estate, with strong walls and towers that spoke of both wealth and power. Torches blazed in the windows, their warm light a welcome sight after the cold journey. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Elara could see figures moving in the courtyard, servants going about their evening duties. The gates stood open, guarded by men in matching livery of deep blue and silver. They nodded to Rowan as the party rode through, their expressions carefully neutral as they noted Elara's presence. She felt their eyes on her and wondered what they thought, what they saw when they looked at her. Did they see just another servant, or had word of her shameful condition somehow preceded her arrival? They dismounted in the courtyard, and immediately stable boys rushed forward to take the horses. Rowan handed his reins to a young lad with practiced ease, then turned to help Elara down. Again she felt the strength in his hands, the careful way he steadied her until she found her footing on the cobblestones. "This way," Rowan said, gesturing toward a heavy wooden door bound with iron. Elara followed, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in this grand setting. The courtyard alone was larger than the entire village square in Thornmere, and the manor itself seemed to loom above her like a sleeping giant, all stone and shadows and flickering torchlight. They passed through the door and into a wide corridor lit by oil lamps set in iron sconces along the walls. The floors were laid with stone that had been worn smooth by countless feet over the years, and tapestries hung at intervals, depicting scenes of hunts and battles that Elara barely had time to register as she hurried to keep pace with Rowan's long strides. The air inside was warmer, heated by fires burning in rooms they passed, and she could smell cooking food, roasted meat and fresh bread that made her stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and the small bundle her father had given her remained untouched in her hands. Rowan led her deeper into the manor, through corridors that twisted and turned until Elara was certain she would never find her way back to the entrance without help. Finally, they emerged into a large kitchen where a dozen servants worked at various tasks, kneading dough, stirring pots over the massive hearth, plucking chickens, chopping vegetables. The noise was overwhelming after the quiet of the journey, a cacophony of voices and clattering pots and sizzling food that made Elara's head spin. A large woman with arms like tree trunks and a face red from the heat of the fires looked up as they entered. Her gray hair was pulled back severely beneath a white cap, and her expression suggested she suffered no fools. This, Elara guessed, must be the head cook, the one who ruled this domain with an iron fist. "Rowan," the woman said, her voice carrying easily over the din. "About time you returned. We were beginning to worry." Her sharp eyes fixed on Elara, taking in every detail of her appearance in a single sweeping glance. "This is the new girl?" "This is Elara," Rowan confirmed. "She's had a long journey and needs food and a place to sleep. Can you see to it, Martha?" Martha wiped her hands on her apron and moved closer, circling Elara like a hawk examining potential prey. "She's skin and bones. Doesn't look like she could lift a full water bucket, let alone handle a day's work in my kitchen." "I'm stronger than I look," Elara said quietly, lifting her chin to meet Martha's gaze. She wouldn't start her new life by appearing weak or incapable, no matter how terrified she felt. "I've worked hard all my life. I can learn whatever you need me to do." Something shifted in Martha's expression, a slight softening around the eyes. "Well, at least you've got some spirit in you. That's more than can be said for the last girl they brought here." She turned to Rowan. "I'll see she's fed and given a bed in the servants' quarters. Lord Caspian will want to meet her tomorrow, I suppose." Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, send her to the study after breakfast. As you say." Martha gestured for Elara to follow her. "Come along then, girl. Let's get some food in you before you collapse." Elara glanced back at Rowan, meaning to thank him again for his kindness on the journey, but he had already turned away, striding back through the kitchen with the purposeful gait of a man with important business to attend to. She felt an unexpected pang at his departure, which was ridiculous considering she barely knew the man. Yet there had been something in his manner, some small kindness in his treatment of her that had provided a tiny measure of comfort in this frightening new world. Martha led her to a small table in the corner of the kitchen and practically shoved her into a chair. "Wait here," she commanded, then disappeared into the chaos of the working kitchen. She returned moments later with a wooden bowl filled with thick stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a mug of what turned out to be weak ale. "Eat slowly. You look like you haven't had a decent meal in months, and I won't have you making yourself sick." Elara wanted to fall upon the food like a starving animal, but she forced herself to heed Martha's advice, taking small bites and chewing carefully. The stew was rich with meat and vegetables, seasoned with herbs that exploded with flavor on her tongue. It was better than anything she'd eaten in years, perhaps better than anything she'd ever eaten. The bread was fresh and still warm from the ovens, and she had to resist the urge to stuff it all in her mouth at once. As she ate, Martha sat across from her, watching with those sharp eyes that seemed to see far too much. "So," the older woman said, "what's your story then? Why would a young thing like you end up sold to service here?" Elara swallowed hard, the food suddenly turning to ash in her mouth. "My family needed the money," she said carefully, unwilling to reveal the full humiliating truth to this stranger. "And they couldn't find you a husband?" Martha pressed. "You're comely enough, despite being half-starved. Surely some farmer's son would have taken you. I'm barren, Elara said flatly, deciding that honesty was better than having the truth dragged out of her piece by painful piece. The healer confirmed it 3 years ago. No man wants a wife who can't give him children. She expected disgust or pity, the same reactions she'd endured from the villagers of Thornmere. Instead, Martha simply nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Well, that's a hard lot, I'll not deny it. But it means you're free of certain troubles that plague other women. No risk of getting yourself in a family way with some foolish man. No dying in childbed like so many do. There's worse fates, girl, though I don't expect you to see it that way just yet. It was perhaps the kindest response Elara had ever received regarding her condition, and it made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall here, now, in front of this practical woman who had shown her more compassion in 5 minutes than her own mother had in 3 years. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha waved a hand dismissively. "No need for thanks. Just truth. Now finish your food. I'll show you to your quarters, and tomorrow your real work begins. Lord Caspian runs a tight household, but he's fair if you work hard and keep your nose clean. Do your job well, and you'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly. That's more than many can say these days." Elara finished her meal in silence, savoring every bite despite the turmoil of emotions churning inside her. When the bowl was empty and the last crumb of bread consumed, Martha led her up a narrow staircase at the back of the kitchen. They climbed 2 flights, passing servants hurrying up and down on various errands, until they reached a long corridor lined with doors. "The servants' quarters," Martha explained, opening one of the doors to reveal a small room with 4 narrow beds. 3 were clearly occupied, personal belongings scattered on small wooden chests at their feet, rough blankets rumpled from use. The 4th bed, nearest the window, stood empty and waiting. "You'll share with 3 other house servants. They're good girls for the most part. Work hard, don't cause trouble. This will be your bed. There's a chest for your things, such as they are, and blankets enough to keep you warm. We rise before dawn, so I suggest you get what sleep you can." Elara moved to her assigned bed, sitting on the thin mattress that was still far more comfortable than the straw pallet she'd slept on in her parents' cottage. She set down the bundle her father had given her. She'd been clutching it this entire time without realizing, and began to remove Rowan's heavy cloak. "Keep it for now," Martha said from the doorway. "The nights are cold up here, and you'll need all the warmth you can get until we can find you a proper blanket. Return it to Rowan tomorrow after you meet with Lord Caspian." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "I know this is all strange and frightening, girl, but you'll adjust. We all do. Just remember to keep your head down, work hard, and stay out of trouble. This can be a good life, if you let it." Then she was gone, closing the door behind her and leaving Elara alone in the small room that would be her home for the foreseeable future. Elara lay back on the bed, pulling Rowan's cloak over her like a blanket. The scent of him still clung to the fabric, leather and pine, and that indefinable masculine quality that made her feel oddly safe, despite everything that had happened. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with everything that had occurred that day. This morning she had woken in her parents' cottage, knowing what was to come, but not truly believing it would happen. Now she lay in a manor house miles from everything she had ever known, surrounded by strangers, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. The fear she had been holding at bay all day finally broke through, and silent tears slid down her temples into her hair. She grieved for the life she would never have, for the family who had cast her aside, for the dreams of love and home and belonging that would never be hers. But even as she wept, a small part of her, a part she hadn't known still existed, whispered that perhaps this was not an ending, but a beginning. Perhaps in this new place, away from the judgment and pity of those who had known her all her life, she might find something she had never dared hope for. Not happiness, perhaps. That seemed too much to ask. But maybe peace, maybe purpose. Maybe a chance to prove that her worth was not measured solely by her ability to bear children. The door opened quietly, and 3 young women filed in, their conversation dying as they noticed the stranger in their room. They were all roughly Elara's age, dressed in simple servants' clothing similar to her own but in better repair. The tallest of them, a girl with red hair and freckles scattered across her nose, approached first, her expression curious but not unfriendly. "You must be the new girl Martha told us about," she said, her accent marking her as local to this region. "I'm Bridget. That's Anne and Catherine." She gestured to her companions. Anne was small and dark-haired with quick, clever eyes, while Catherine was plump and pretty with blonde braids coiled around her head. "Elara," she managed, wiping quickly at her face and hoping they hadn't noticed her tears. "I arrived this evening." "We know," Anne said, coming to sit on her own bed. "The whole household's been talking about it. Word travels fast in a place like this." Her eyes were sharp and assessing, but not unkind. "You're from that village to the north, aren't you? Thornmere?" Elara nodded, unsure what else they might know or what stories might already be circulating about her. But if they knew about her condition, they gave no sign of it. "Well, you'll learn the ways of the household quickly enough," Catherine said, her voice softer than the others. "Lord Caspian is a good master, better than most. He doesn't allow the male servants to bother us, and he makes sure we're fed proper and treated with respect. You could have done worse." "Much worse," Bridget agreed. "I've heard stories from my cousins who work in other great houses, lords who think the servant girls are there for their amusement, overseers who work you until you drop and don't care if you're sick or injured. Lord Caspian isn't like that. He's different." Something in the way she said it made Elara curious. Different how? The three girls exchanged glances, as if deciding how much to reveal to this newcomer. Finally, Anne leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's not like other nobles. He trains with his guards, rides out on patrols of his lands, settles disputes himself instead of leaving everything to his steward. Some say he's more warrior than lord, that he earned his position through strength and cunning rather than just being born to it. And he's—" Catherine paused, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "Well, he's handsome, very handsome. All the servant girls are half in love with him, though he pays us no mind in that way. He's always proper, always respectful, but distant, like he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders and can't afford any distractions." Elara thought of Rowan, wondering if Lord Caspian would be similar. That same air of contained strength, that same sense of danger barely held in check. Tomorrow she would meet this lord who had purchased her service, and the thought filled her with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. "Get some sleep," Bridget advised, beginning to change into her night clothes. "Martha will have you up before dawn, and the first few days are always the hardest. Your body needs to adjust to the work." The four of them settled into their beds, and Anne extinguished the single candle that lit the room, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the small window. Elara pulled Rowan's cloak tighter around herself, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the manor. Distant voices, footsteps in the corridor outside, the crackle of fires in rooms below. Gradually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of dark blue eyes and roads that led into endless forests. She woke to Bridget shaking her shoulder, the room still dark, but with the faint suggestion of pre-dawn gray at the window. "Up," Bridget said, not unkindly. "Martha will have our hides if we're late to the kitchen." Elara rose quickly, her body stiff from the long ride and the unfamiliar bed. She folded Rowan's cloak carefully, setting it on her chest to return later, and followed the other girls down the narrow stairs to the kitchen. Martha was already there, of course, directing the morning chaos with the authority of a general commanding troops. The massive hearth blazed with multiple fires, pots already bubbling with porridge for the household's breakfast. "Elara," Martha called, spotting her. "You'll start with simple tasks until you learn the routine. Help Catherine with the bread dough. She'll show you what to do. And don't dawdle. We've got over 50 mouths to feed this morning." The work was hard and constant, but Elara threw herself into it with determination. She helped knead the heavy dough until her arms ached, carried water from the well until her shoulders screamed in protest, scrubbed pots with sand and lye until her hands were raw. The other servants worked around her with practiced efficiency, most ignoring her entirely, though a few offered brief nods or words of advice when she seemed particularly lost. As the morning wore on and the household's breakfast was prepared and served, Elara caught glimpses of the manor's inhabitants, well-dressed ladies and gentlemen passing through the corridors, guards in their blue and silver livery, a priest in dark robes who blessed the morning meal. But she saw no sign of Lord Caspian himself, nor of Rowan, and she couldn't help but wonder where they were and what they were doing. Finally, as the breakfast chaos began to settle, and the kitchen staff grabbed quick bites of porridge and bread for themselves. Martha pulled Elara aside. "Clean yourself up as best you can," she instructed. "Lord Caspian wants to see you in his study. Bridget will show you the way. And remember, be respectful, answer his questions truthfully, and for heaven's sake, try not to look so terrified. He's not going to eat you." Elara's stomach twisted with nerves as she washed her face and hands in a basin of cold water, trying to make herself presentable. She had no other clothes to change into, so she simply smoothed down her worn dress and retied her hair as neatly as she could manage. Bridget appeared at her elbow, gesturing for her to follow. They wound through the manor's corridors again, this time in daylight that streamed through tall windows, illuminating the tapestries and painted walls that Elara had barely noticed in the darkness of the previous evening. The manor was even more impressive by day, a testament to wealth and power that made her feel impossibly small and insignificant. Finally, they stopped before a heavy oak door bound with iron. "This is Lord Caspian's private study," Bridget whispered. "Knock and wait to be admitted. And Elara, he may seem intimidating, but truly, he's fair. Just be honest with him." Then she was gone, hurrying back to her duties, leaving Elara alone in the corridor. Elara raised her hand and knocked, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. For a moment there was nothing, and she wondered if she should knock again or simply wait. Then a voice called from within, deep and commanding, "Enter." She pushed open the heavy door and stepped into a large room lined with shelves of books and scrolls. A fire burned in the hearth, taking the chill from the air, and morning light streamed through tall windows that overlooked the manor's grounds. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers and ledgers and various instruments for writing. And behind that desk, rising to his feet as she entered, was the man she had taken for the steward, Rowan. Elara's mind reeled, unable to process what she was seeing. The man who had ridden to Thornmere, who had purchased her service, who had given her his cloak. That man now stood before her in the trappings of nobility. He wore a tunic of deep blue wool embroidered with silver thread, a heavy belt of worked leather around his waist from which hung a nobleman's sword. His dark hair was pulled back from his face, revealing the sharp angles of his features, and those intense blue eyes watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're confused," he said, "and it wasn't a question. That's understandable. I apologize for the deception, though it was necessary. I am Lord Caspian, ruler of these lands and master of this house. The man you knew as Rowan, the steward, that was a role I played. I often travel among my people in disguise, observing, learning what they truly think and how they truly live. It allows me to rule more justly." Elara's mind struggled to adjust to this revelation. Lord Caspian, the man who had shown her kindness on the journey, who had given her his cloak, who had helped her mount her horse and dismount with such careful courtesy. He was the lord of this manor, the noble who had purchased her service for 20 silver coins. "My lord," Elara breathed, dropping into an awkward curtsy that she had seen other village girls perform, but had never quite mastered herself. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she realized how she had spoken to him on the journey, how casually she had accepted his cloak, how she had allowed herself to feel that small flicker of comfort in his presence. He was a lord, and she was nothing, less than nothing now, a purchased servant whose only value lay in the work her hands could perform. "Please sit," Caspian said, gesturing to a chair positioned before his desk. When she hesitated, he added more firmly, "That was not a suggestion, Elara. Sit." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to bolt at any moment. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she kept her eyes downcast, unable to meet his gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally he spoke again. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable authority. When she lifted her eyes reluctantly to his face, she found him studying her with that same intense scrutiny he had shown in Thornmere. "Better. I need to see your eyes when we speak. They tell me more than your words ever could." Elara swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain eye contact, despite every instinct that screamed at her to lower her gaze in deference to his rank. This close, in the bright morning light streaming through the windows, she could see details she had missed before. The faint scar that traced along his left temple, disappearing into his hairline. The calluses on his hands that spoke of sword work and hard labor, rather than the soft life of privilege. the way he held himself with a warrior's readiness, even in this quiet study. "I want you to understand something," Caspian continued, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers before him. "I did not purchase your service on a whim, nor did I choose you simply because you were available and cheap. I have been observing your village for some time, watching how the people there treat those they consider beneath them or useless. Your situation came to my attention 3 months ago." Elara's eyes widened in surprise. 3 months ago? But how? "I make it my business to know what happens in the villages and towns under my protection," he interrupted. "When I learned that Thomas of Thornmere was planning to sell his daughter to settle his debts, I investigated further. I learned about your circumstances, about the judgment you faced from your community, about how your own family blamed you for something beyond your control." His jaw tightened, a flash of anger crossing his features. "I also learned that several men of questionable character had expressed interest in purchasing you, men who would not have treated you with the respect and dignity you deserve." The implications of his words sent a chill down Elara's spine. She had not known, her parents had not told her, that other buyers had been considered. She thought of some of the harder men she had seen in the village, men who looked at women with hungry eyes and cruel smiles, and felt sick at the thought of what her fate might have been. "So, I sent word to your father that I would pay more than any other buyer," Caspian continued. 20 silver coins, far more than he deserved for betraying his own daughter. "But I wanted to ensure you came here rather than ending up in some brothel, or as some merchant's unwilling mistress. You saved me," Elara whispered, the full weight of his actions beginning to dawn on her. "You didn't need a servant at all. You rescued me." "I needed a servant," Caspian corrected, though something in his expression softened. "But yes, I also wanted to offer you a better life than the one you were facing. Here, you will work hard, but you will be treated fairly. You will have food, shelter, safety, and," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you will have the opportunity to prove that your worth extends far beyond your ability to bear children." Tears pricked at Elara's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She had cried enough in the past day. She would not break down in front of this lord who had shown her more kindness than her own family. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this for a stranger? You don't know me. I'm nobody." "You're not nobody," Caspian said firmly, leaning forward and fixing her with that intense blue gaze. "You're a woman who has been treated unjustly by circumstances and by people who should have protected you. I have little tolerance for injustice, Elara. And as for why, let's just say I understand what it's like to be judged for something beyond your control, to have your worth questioned because you don't fit into the narrow boxes society has created." There was a story there, Elara sensed, some pain in his past that had shaped him into the man he was now. But before she could gather the courage to ask, he was speaking again, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. "Now, as to your duties here. Martha tells me you worked hard this morning and showed aptitude for learning. That's good. You'll continue working in the kitchens for now, learning the routines of the household. As you prove yourself capable, you may be given additional responsibilities. I expect honesty, hard work, and loyalty from all who serve in this house. In return, you will be treated with respect and compensated fairly. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord," Elara replied, her voice steadier now. "I will work as hard as I can. I promise you won't regret giving me this chance." "I don't make decisions I regret," Caspian said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. He stood, moving around the desk to stand before her, and she rose quickly to her feet, acutely aware of how much taller he was, how the strength in his frame made her feel small and protected all at once. He reached out, and for a moment she thought he might touch her face, but instead he simply adjusted the collar of her worn dress with a gentle, almost absent gesture. "You brought my cloak back. I left it in my quarters," Elara said. "I meant to return it this morning, but Martha sent me directly here. I can fetch it now if—" "Keep it," Caspian interrupted. "The nights are cold, and you'll need it more than I will. Consider it a gift, along with this." He moved back to his desk and withdrew a small leather pouch, pressing it into her hands. "There are 5 silver coins here. Use them to purchase proper clothing from the seamstress in the village. Warm dresses, a good cloak of your own, sturdy shoes. I'll arrange for you to go to market next week with some of the other servants." Elara stared at the pouch in her hands, stunned. 5 silver coins was more money than she had ever held in her life. a quarter of what her entire person had been worth to her father. "My lord, I cannot accept this. It's too much." "It's practical," Caspian said firmly. "You can't work effectively if you're cold and your clothing is falling apart. This is an investment in a capable servant, nothing more." But the way he said it, the slight softening around his eyes, suggested it was something more, though Elara couldn't quite define what. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the pouch to her chest. "Thank you, my lord. I don't know how to repay such kindness." "Thrive," he said simply. "Build a life here. Prove to yourself that you have value beyond what those fools in your village believed. That will be payment enough." He moved to the door, opening it for her. "You may return to the kitchens. Martha will be wondering what's keeping you." Elara moved toward the door, then paused, gathering her courage. "My lord, may I ask you something?" Caspian raised an eyebrow but nodded. "You may ask, I may not answer. Why do you travel in disguise? Why pretend to be your own steward?" The question had been burning in her mind since the revelation of his true identity. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with weariness that seemed at odds with his powerful frame. "Because when people know who I am, they tell me what they think I want to hear rather than the truth. They hide their real natures, their real problems, their real thoughts. As a disguised steward, I see the world as it truly is. The injustices, the cruelties, the small kindnesses that happen when people think no one important is watching. It makes me a better lord. And sometimes," he paused, his eyes distant, "it allows me to help people who would never accept help from a lord, but might accept it from a simple steward." "Like me," Elara said softly. "Like you," he agreed. "Now go. We've both wasted enough of the morning on philosophy when there's work to be done." Elara curtsied again, more gracefully this time, and slipped out of the study. She stood in the corridor for a moment, her mind whirling with everything that had just happened. Lord Caspian was not what she had expected, not some distant, cold noble concerned only with his own pleasures and power. He was complicated, thoughtful, carrying his own burdens that she could only guess at, and he had saved her, though he dressed it up as mere practicality. She clutched the pouch of coins and made her way back to the kitchens, where Martha immediately put her to work, chopping vegetables for the midday meal. As she worked, the other servants gradually became more friendly, offering advice and the occasional jest. Bridget worked beside her, showing her the proper way to dice onions without weeping like a babe, while Catherine sang softly as she kneaded bread, her voice sweet and clear. The days began to blur together in a rhythm of work and exhaustion. Elara rose before dawn each morning, worked until her body ached, ate simple but filling meals, and collapsed into her bed each night too tired for the nightmares that had plagued her first few nights. Slowly, gradually, she began to learn the ways of the household, which servants could be trusted and which were prone to gossip and backstabbing, which guards were kind and which had wandering hands that Martha dealt with swiftly and severely, which tasks she excelled at, and which she struggled with. She saw Lord Caspian only rarely in those first weeks, and always from a distance. He would pass through the kitchens occasionally, checking on supplies or speaking with Martha about menus for important dinners. Once she saw him in the courtyard, training with his guards, his sword moving in blurred arcs as he sparred with 3 men at once. The casual skill and power in his movements were breathtaking, and she understood then what Catherine had meant when she said he was more warrior than lord. But he never spoke to her directly, never singled her out or gave any indication that she was anything more than just another servant among dozens. Elara told herself she was grateful for this, that she had no desire for special attention that would make the other servants jealous or suspicious. Yet some small part of her, a part she tried desperately to ignore, felt disappointed each time he walked past without acknowledging her presence. 3 weeks after her arrival, Martha announced that a group of servants would be going to market in the village the following day, and Elara was to accompany them. "Time to get you some proper clothing," the older woman said. "Can't have you looking like a beggar while you work in this house. Reflects poorly on all of us." The village was a 2-hour journey by cart, and Elara found herself squeezed between Bridget and Anne, with Catherine sitting across from them. The other servants chattered excitedly about the market, about what they hoped to buy or see, about the young men who worked the various stalls. Elara listened more than she spoke, content to observe this new world she was slowly becoming part of. The market was a riot of color and noise and smells, vendors hawking their wares, animals penned and waiting to be sold, the scent of baking bread mingling with less pleasant odors of manure and unwashed bodies. Elara had been to market days in Thornmere, of course, but this was on a different scale entirely, a weekly gathering that drew people from villages and farms for miles around. Bridget took charge, leading them directly to a seamstress she knew. The woman, a middle-aged widow with clever hands and a sharp eye, took one look at Elara and tutted disapprovingly. Skin and bones, and wearing rags that should have been thrown on the fire years ago. Well, let's see what we can do. She measured Elara efficiently, all business, then brought out bolts of sturdy wool in shades of brown and dark blue and deep green. These will wear well and keep you warm. You'll want at least 3 dresses, one for working, one for washing, one for spare, and a proper cloak, lined with rabbit fur. Can't have you catching your death in winter. Elara counted out the coins Lord Caspian had given her, watching them disappear with each purchase. The seamstress promised to have everything ready within the week, and Bridget assured her that Lord Caspian's carter would collect the order when he made his regular supply run. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the market, and Elara used the few remaining coins to purchase a small silver comb for her hair and a bar of lavender soap, small luxuries that felt impossibly indulgent. As they prepared to return to the manor, loaded down with various purchases for the household, Elara caught sight of a familiar figure across the crowded square. Her father, Thomas, stood beside a merchant's stall, counting coins with shaking hands. He looked older somehow, more bent and broken than he had been just 3 weeks before. For a moment, Elara felt the old familiar pull of duty and love, the urge to go to him and make sure he was well. But then she saw her mother emerge from a nearby shop, her face hard and satisfied as she examined some fabric, and the moment passed. They had sold her. They had chosen silver over their own daughter, and no amount of poverty or desperation could fully excuse that betrayal. Elara turned away, following Bridget back to the cart, and did not look back. That part of her life was over. Whatever lay ahead, it would be built on her own strength and the kindness of strangers who had proven themselves more family than blood ever had. The journey back to the manor was quieter, the other servants drowsy from the sun and the excitement of the market. Elara let her mind wander, thinking about Lord Caspian and his strange kindness, about Martha's gruff affection, about the small community of servants who were slowly accepting her as one of their own. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a girl. No husband, no children, no home of her own. But it was a life, and it was hers, and perhaps that was enough. When they arrived back at the manor, Martha was in a state of controlled chaos, preparing for what she called one of Lord Caspian's informal dinners, which Elara quickly learned was anything but informal. Apparently several lords and ladies from neighboring estates were arriving that evening for a meal and discussion of some political matter that the kitchen staff couldn't quite piece together from the fragments they overheard. "Elara," Martha called, "you'll help serve tonight. I know you haven't done it before, but we're short-handed with Marjorie sick and Alice visiting her ailing mother. Bridget will show you what to do. Just keep your eyes down, your mouth shut, and don't spill anything on anyone important." Serving at a noble dinner was more complicated than Elara had imagined. There was a precise order to everything. Which dishes came out when, how to pour wine without dripping, how to stand waiting in the shadows until needed without fidgeting or drawing attention. Bridget walked her through it all with patient efficiency, and by the time the guests began arriving, Elara felt reasonably confident she wouldn't disgrace herself entirely. The dining hall was magnificent, lit by dozens of candles in iron chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across the stone walls. Long tables had been arranged in a U-shape, covered with fine linen cloths, and set with pewter plates and goblets that gleamed in the flickering light. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes and historical battles hung between the tall windows, their rich colors muted by the evening darkness beyond the glass. A fire roared in the massive hearth at the far end of the hall, filling the space with warmth and the sweet scent of burning applewood. Elara took her position along the wall with the other serving staff, trying to make herself as invisible as possible while her heart hammered against her ribs. She had never been in such close proximity to nobility before, and the sight of the lords and ladies in their fine clothing, velvet and silk and jewel tones, trimmed with fur and embroidered with gold and silver thread, made her acutely aware of her own worn dress and rough hands. Lord Caspian entered last, and Elara felt her breath catch despite her best efforts to remain detached. He wore a tunic of midnight blue wool so dark it was almost black, embroidered at the collar and cuffs with silver thread in patterns that caught the candlelight. A heavy chain of silver links hung around his neck, and his sword, not the practical blade he wore for training but an ornate weapon with jewels set into the pommel, hung at his side. His dark hair was pulled back from his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of his features and those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. He looked every inch the powerful lord, commanding and dangerous, and Elara realized with a start that this was perhaps the truest version of him, not the disguised steward, not the thoughtful man in his study, but this warrior nobleman who ruled these lands with strength and cunning. The guests rose as he entered, and he gestured for them to sit with the casual authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "Please, my friends, be seated. Let us not stand on excessive ceremony tonight. We have much to discuss, and I prefer to do so with good food and better wine." As the nobles took their seats, Elara noticed the woman sitting to Caspian's right. She was perhaps 30 years old, beautiful in the way of a predatory cat, with raven black hair elaborately arranged and held in place with jeweled pins. Her dress was deep crimson velvet, cut low across her bosom in a way that drew the eye, and she wore enough jewelry to ransom a small village. Rings on her fingers, bracelets on her wrists, a necklace of rubies around her throat. But it was her eyes that captured Elara's attention. Dark and calculating, they swept across the room as if assessing the value of everything they touched, including the serving staff. "Lord Caspian," the woman purred, her voice carrying across the hall as the first course was brought out, "you keep such a modest household for a man of your considerable wealth and power. One would think you would surround yourself with more refinement." "I prefer function over ostentation, Lady Ravenna," Caspian replied smoothly, accepting a goblet of wine from one of the servants. "My people eat well, my lands are protected, and my coffers are full. What more refinement does a man need?" Lady Ravenna laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How very practical of you. But surely even you must tire of such Spartan existence. A man needs softness in his life, beauty to look upon after a hard day's work." Her hand, Elara noticed with a spike of something that felt disturbingly like jealousy, rested on Caspian's arm, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his sleeve. Bridget appeared at Elara's elbow carrying a large platter of roasted venison. "That's Lady Ravenna Blackwood," she whispered as they waited for their cue to serve. "Widow of Lord Blackwood who died last winter. She's been trying to sink her claws into Lord Caspian for months now. Thinks she'll be the next lady of this manor." "Will she?" Elara whispered back, surprised by how much the answer mattered to her. Bridget snorted softly. "Lord Caspian's not a fool, and that woman is poison wrapped in silk. He's polite to her because politics demand it. Her late husband's lands border ours, and we need the alliance. But he'll never marry her. Martha says he can barely stand to be in the same room with her." They moved forward to serve, and Elara found herself approaching the high table where Caspian sat. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached to refill his wine goblet, terrified she would spill and humiliate herself in front of all these important people. But her hand remained steady, and as she poured she felt rather than saw Caspian's eyes on her. It was the briefest glance, so quick that anyone watching would have missed it. But in that moment his gaze met hers and something passed between them. A connection, an acknowledgement, a reminder that beneath all the trappings of rank and ceremony, they had shared honest words in his study. Then the moment was gone, and she was stepping back into the shadows as conversation resumed around the table. The nobles discussed politics and trade routes, complaints about bandits in the forests and the need for increased patrols. Lord Brennan, a grizzled old warrior with scars marking half his face, argued for a more aggressive stance against the thieves. "We should hunt them down like the animals they are," he growled, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make the goblets jump. "Show no mercy. String up a few bodies along the main roads and see if that doesn't discourage the rest." "That would only create martyrs and increase recruitment to their cause," Caspian countered, his voice calm but firm. "These bandits are not common criminals. They're desperate men driven to crime by circumstances. Many were soldiers once, cast off when the wars ended with no means of supporting themselves. Others are farmers who lost their lands to debt or drought. Kill them, and their families and friends will simply take their places. nursing grudges against noble lords who hang hungry men for the crime of wanting to eat. "So what do you suggest?" Lady Ravenna asked, her tone suggesting she found the entire discussion tedious. "That we simply allow them to rob and murder as they please? I suggest we address the root causes," Caspian replied. "I've been in contact with the leaders of the largest band operating in our region. They call themselves the Brotherhood of the Wolf, and their leader is a man named Gareth. I've offered them a deal: lay down their arms, cease their raids, and I will grant them land to farm and work to do in my service. Those who wish to continue as soldiers can join my guard. Those who prefer peaceful life can rebuild their lives as productive members of our community." The table erupted in protests and exclamations of disbelief. Lord Brennan looked apoplectic, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "You would reward thieves and murderers? Give them land that should go to loyal subjects? This is madness. This is pragmatism," Caspian said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "We can spend years and countless lives hunting these men through the forests, losing good soldiers and innocent travelers to their raids, or we can turn enemies into allies and strengthen our numbers. I prefer the latter." "And if they betray you?" asked a younger lord, his expression thoughtful despite his obvious concern. "If they take your offer and then rise against you when they've been trained and armed, then I will have been wrong, and I will deal with that threat when it arises," Caspian acknowledged. "But I don't believe it will come to that. Gareth and his men are not motivated by greed or cruelty. They're motivated by survival. Give them a better option, and they'll take it." Elara listened from her position against the wall, fascinated despite herself. This was not how she had imagined noble lords conducted their business. She had expected arrogance and certainty, not this careful weighing of options and consideration of consequences. Caspian spoke with the other lords as equals rather than subordinates, listening to their arguments even when he clearly disagreed, building consensus rather than simply imposing his will. The meal continued through multiple courses: the venison followed by roasted fowl, then fish in a cream sauce, then various vegetables and breads and cheeses. Wine flowed freely, and the conversation grew louder and more animated as the evening progressed. Lady Ravenna became increasingly bold in her attentions to Caspian, her hand constantly finding excuses to touch his arm, her body leaning close to his as she whispered comments that made some of the other guests smirk knowingly. Elara told herself she had no right to feel the hot surge of anger that rose in her chest each time Lady Ravenna touched him. He was a lord, she was a servant, and what he did, or who he entertained, was none of her concern. Yet she couldn't stop watching them, couldn't stop imagining what it would be like to be beautiful and wealthy and confident enough to claim the attention of a man like Caspian without shame or hesitation. As she moved to refill wine goblets again, she caught fragments of a conversation between two of the younger lords seated near the end of the table. "Heard he was married once," one was saying, his voice low, but carrying in a brief lull in the general conversation. "Years ago, before he inherited these lands. The wife died in childbirth, along with the babe. Some say that's why he's so cold to women's advances now. He's still mourning." "I heard different," the other replied. "I heard the marriage was arranged, that he never loved her at all, and when she died he felt nothing but relief. They say that's why he refuses to marry again. He won't be trapped in another loveless union for the sake of politics and heirs." Elara's hand trembled, and a drop of wine spilled onto the white linen tablecloth. She froze, horrified, waiting for someone to notice and rebuke her. But the nobles were too absorbed in their own conversations, and she quickly moved away, her mind reeling from what she had overheard. Caspian had been married. He had lost a wife and child. Suddenly his earlier words in his study made terrible sense. He understood what it was like to be judged for something beyond one's control. Perhaps people had blamed him for his wife's death, or questioned his grief, or expected him to simply move on and marry again as if one woman was interchangeable with another. The dinner finally concluded as the candles burned low and the fire in the hearth settled to glowing coals. The nobles rose, some steadier on their feet than others after the generous quantities of wine, and began making their farewells. Accommodations had been prepared for those staying overnight, and servants appeared to guide them to their chambers. Lady Ravenna was among those remaining, and she made no secret of her disappointment when Caspian bowed over her hand with perfect courtesy, but nothing more. "You are always such a gentleman, my lord," she said, her voice heavy with suggestion. "Perhaps too much of a gentleman. One day I hope you'll allow yourself to be something more interesting. I am as interesting as I need to be, my lady, Caspian replied, his tone neutral. I bid you good night. My servants will see you to your chambers. As the hall began to empty and the serving staff started the work of clearing away the remains of the feast, Martha appeared at Elara's side. You did well tonight, girl. No major disasters, and I saw you catch that spill before it became a problem. Lord Caspian noticed too, gave me a nod of approval when you handled it smoothly. Elara felt a warm flush of pleasure at the praise, quickly followed by embarrassment at how much it meant to her. She was being foolish, allowing herself to care too much about the opinion of a lord who barely knew she existed, yet she couldn't seem to help herself. The next morning brought news that sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the household. A messenger had arrived at dawn with word that Gareth, leader of the Brotherhood of the Wolf, had accepted Lord Caspian's offer and would be arriving within 3 days to discuss terms. The manor erupted into a flurry of activity as preparations were made, guest quarters to be readied, supplies to be stockpiled, weapons to be checked, and guards to be drilled in case the negotiations went poorly. Elara found herself caught up in the chaos, working alongside the other servants to prepare the manor for what everyone agreed would be a dangerous and unprecedented meeting. Former bandits, welcomed as guests and potential allies rather than hunted as criminals. It was unheard of, and opinion among the staff was sharply divided. Some thought Lord Caspian was brilliant, others thought him mad, and most thought him some combination of both. He's taking a terrible risk, Anne said as they worked together in the kitchens, peeling what seemed like hundreds of potatoes for the meals that would be required. What if these bandits murder him in his sleep? What if they're just pretending to accept his offer so they can get inside the walls and slaughter us all? Lord Caspian knows what he's doing, Catherine replied with the serene confidence of someone half in love with their lord. He's never led us wrong before. If he trusts these men enough to meet with them, then I trust his judgment. Bridget snorted. Your trust is admirable, Catherine, but misplaced. No man is infallible, not even our Lord. Still, I suppose we'll know soon enough if this is brilliance or folly. The 3 days passed in a blur of work and speculation. Elara caught glimpses of Caspian during this time, always moving with purpose through the manor, conferring with his guards and advisors, checking preparations personally rather than leaving everything to subordinates. She noticed that he wore his sword constantly now, and that additional guards had been posted at strategic points throughout the manor. He was taking precautions, she realized, even as he extended this offer of peace. He trusted, but he was not foolish about it. On the morning of the 3rd day, word came that riders had been spotted on the road. The Brotherhood was approaching. Martha ordered all servants to go about their duties normally, to show no fear or hesitation that might be interpreted as weakness. Elara found herself assigned to serve in the Great Hall again, where the meeting would take place, and her stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The bandits arrived as the sun reached its zenith, a group of 30 men on horseback, led by a figure who could only be Gareth. He was a tall man, lean and hard as weathered oak, with long brown hair streaked with gray and a face marked by old scars and hard living. He wore leather and fur, practical clothing for a life spent in the forests, and he carried himself with the wary confidence of a wolf entering territory that might be friendly or hostile. His men spread out behind him, hands resting on weapons but not drawing them, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Lord Caspian met them in the courtyard, flanked by his guards but making no aggressive moves. The two men studied each other for a long moment, and Elara held her breath, wondering if violence would erupt despite all the careful negotiations. Then Gareth dismounted and approached, and Caspian stepped forward to meet him. You came, Caspian said simply. You offered terms worth considering, Gareth replied, his voice rough from years of shouting orders and living rough. But talk is cheap, my lord. I need to see proof that your offer is genuine, that this isn't some elaborate trap to capture or kill me and my men. If I wanted you dead, Gareth, I could have sent assassins or offered a bounty that would have had half the kingdom hunting you, Caspian said bluntly. I don't need tricks or traps. I need good men who are willing to work for a better future. Come inside. Let us discuss the details like civilized people rather than shouting at each other in the courtyard. Gareth's weathered face split in a grin that held little humor. Civilized? Haven't been called that in years. Very well, my lord. Let's see if you can make a civilized man out of an old wolf. The negotiations took place in the Great Hall, with Gareth and 5 of his most trusted men seated across from Lord Caspian and his advisors. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the potential for violence despite the peaceful intentions declared by both sides. Elara and the other servants moved quietly around the edges of the room, pouring ale and bringing food, trying to be invisible while their ears caught every word of the historic discussion unfolding before them. "Let me be clear about what I'm offering," Caspian said, his hands flat on the table before him, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Every man in your brotherhood who wishes to leave the outlaw life will be given a choice. Those with farming skills will be granted plots of land, not the richest soil, mind you, but good enough to support a family if a man is willing to work hard. You'll have seed for planting, basic tools, and 1 year's reprieve from taxes to get established. After that, you pay the same dues as any other farmer on my lands." Gareth leaned back in his chair, his scarred hands wrapped around a mug of ale. "And for those of us who were soldiers, who know nothing but fighting, you'll be integrated into my guard, but on a probationary basis," Caspian continued. 6 months of service during which you'll be watched carefully. Prove yourselves loyal and capable, and you'll receive full standing as guardsmen with appropriate pay and benefits. Betray that trust and you'll hang. I'm offering redemption, Gareth, not absolution. Your past actions will be forgiven, but your future actions will be judged harshly if you prove me wrong. One of Gareth's men, a younger fellow with a hot look in his eyes, leaned forward. "And what guarantee do we have that this isn't just pretty words? That you won't wait until we're settled and comfortable, then round us up like animals?" Caspian's eyes fixed on the young man with an intensity that made even Elara, standing against the far wall, want to step back. "You have my word as lord of these lands. I don't know if that means anything to you, but it should. I've never broken an oath, never betrayed a trust. Ask anyone who serves me, anyone who lives in my villages. I am many things. Some would say too harsh, others too lenient. But I am not a liar." "Words are wind," the young man spat. "How do we know?" "Enough, Marcus," Gareth interrupted, his voice sharp. He studied Caspian for a long moment, and Elara watched as the 2 men engaged in some wordless communication, a measuring of character and intent that went beyond mere words. Finally, Gareth nodded slowly. "I believe you, Lord Caspian. Not because I'm a fool, but because I've been watching you for months. I know how you treat your people, how you ride among them in disguise to see their real lives. I know you could have hunted us down with overwhelming force but chose negotiation instead. That speaks to character. I'm glad we understand each other," Caspian said, something like relief flickering across his features. "But there's one more condition, and it's not negotiable. Any man who joins my service, whether as farmer or guard, must swear an oath of loyalty, not just to me, but to the principles I govern by: justice, fairness, protection of the weak, honesty in all dealings. Break that oath, and you forfeit everything." "Fair enough," Gareth agreed. "When do we begin?" "Tomorrow," Caspian replied. "Tonight you and your men will stay as my guests. We'll feast together, drink together, and you can see for yourself how I treat those under my protection. In the morning, those who wish to take my offer can swear their oaths. Those who don't are free to leave, but they must leave my lands and never return to banditry here. Take your criminal enterprise elsewhere, or face the consequences." Gareth extended his hand across the table, and Caspian gripped it firmly. The handshake sealed the agreement, and a collective exhale seemed to move through the room as the tension broke like a snapped bowstring. Elara felt her shoulders relax, only then realizing how rigidly she'd been holding herself throughout the entire exchange. The feast that night was unlike anything Elara had experienced. The former bandits mingled awkwardly with Caspian's regular guards and household staff. Conversations stilted at first, but gradually warming as ale loosened tongues, and the excellent food put everyone in better spirits. Gareth sat at the high table beside Caspian, and the 2 men talked long into the evening, their conversation ranging from military tactics to farming techniques to the state of the kingdom at large. Elara found herself serving their table repeatedly, and each time she drew close, she caught fragments of their discussion. Gareth spoke of the desperation that had driven him and his men to outlawry, the wars that had left them skilled only in violence, the lack of work when peace came, the slow starvation of families that pushed honorable men to dishonorable acts. Caspian listened with genuine attention, not dismissing or justifying, but seeking to understand. "You could have been anything," Gareth said at one point, his words slightly slurred from drink but his eyes sharp and assessing. "With your skills and intelligence, you could have been a great general, a king's advisor, anything you wanted. Why stay here in this remote corner of the kingdom, dealing with problems like bandit negotiations and local disputes?" Caspian was silent for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his goblet. "Because this is where I'm needed," he said finally. "The great lords at court have enough advisors and sycophants. Here I can make a real difference in people's lives. I can govern justly, protect the vulnerable, create something lasting and good. That matters more to me than titles or proximity to power." "You're an idealist," Gareth observed, but there was respect rather than mockery in his tone. "A dangerous thing to be in this world." "Perhaps," Caspian agreed, "but someone has to believe that things can be better, or they never will be." As the evening wore on and the hall grew rowdy with celebration, Elara slipped out to the kitchen to help with the endless dishes that such a feast generated. She found Martha directing the cleanup with her usual efficient authority, but the older woman's face showed satisfaction rather than stress. "Went well, didn't it?" Martha said, more statement than question. Lord Caspian pulled off something most would have said was impossible. "Those men will serve him loyally, mark my words. He has a way of inspiring that in people." "He does," Elara agreed softly, plunging her hands into a basin of hot water to scrub at a stubborn pot. "I've never met anyone like him." Martha gave her a sharp look, and Elara felt her cheeks flush under that penetrating gaze. "Be careful, girl," the older woman said, her voice low and serious. "I've seen that look before on young women's faces when they look at Lord Caspian. He's a good man, the best I've known, but he's still a lord and you're still a servant. That gap can't be bridged, no matter how much you might wish it could be." "I'm not," Elara began, but Martha cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't lie to me, and don't lie to yourself. I understand the attraction. What woman wouldn't be drawn to a man like that? Strong, just, kind to those weaker than himself. But it can't go anywhere, Elara. He'll marry a lady someday, someone of appropriate rank who can give him heirs and political alliances. You need to guard your heart now, before it gets broken beyond repair." Elara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. Martha was right, of course. She was being foolish, allowing herself to feel things that could only lead to pain. Yet knowing something intellectually and controlling one's heart were two very different matters, and her treacherous heart seemed determined to ignore all logic and reason. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground and breath misting in the air. The Brotherhood gathered in the courtyard, and Caspian stood before them in full ceremonial dress, the midnight blue tunic embroidered with silver, the heavy chain of office around his neck, his ornate sword at his side. He looked every inch the lord, powerful and commanding, yet there was warmth in his eyes as he addressed the men who had been outlaws just days before. "Today you have a choice," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "You can return to your old lives, to the forests and the raids and the constant running, or you can swear an oath to me and begin building something new, a life of honest work, of community, of purpose beyond mere survival. I won't pretend the road ahead will be easy. Some of you will struggle with farming after years of fighting. Some will chafe under the discipline of guard duty. But I promise you this, if you give me your loyalty and your honest effort, I will give you opportunity and justice in return." One by one the men of the Brotherhood came forward and knelt before Caspian, speaking the words of the oath he had crafted, promises of loyalty, honesty, service to the community, and protection of the innocent. Gareth was first, his scarred face solemn as he pledged himself to his former adversary. Marcus, the hot-headed young man from the previous day's negotiations, was among the last, but he too knelt and spoke the words with what seemed like genuine conviction. When it was done, when all 30 men had sworn their oaths, Caspian raised his voice in a declaration that sent shivers down Elara's spine. "From this moment forward you are no longer outlaws. You are men of this holding, under my protection and subject to my justice. Welcome home." The courtyard erupted in cheers, and Elara found herself smiling, despite the ache in her chest. This was what true nobility looked like. Not the preening self-importance of someone like Lady Ravenna, but the courage to take risks for the greater good, to see potential in broken people and offer them redemption. Caspian had done something remarkable here. something that would be talked about for years in the villages and farms throughout the region. The next weeks brought significant changes to the manor and the surrounding lands. The former bandits dispersed to their new assignments, some to the farmlands where they began the hard work of clearing fields and building cottages, others to the barracks where they trained alongside the regular guards. There were tensions at first, suspicions and old grudges that occasionally flared into fights that Caspian put down swiftly and decisively. But gradually, as the newcomers proved their worth and the old-timers saw that these men truly wanted redemption, a new equilibrium formed. Elara's own life settled into a rhythm as well. She had fully adapted to the household routines now, moving through her duties with practiced efficiency. The new clothes she had ordered arrived from the seamstress, and for the first time in her life, she owned dresses that fit properly and a cloak lined with soft fur that kept her warm even on the coldest mornings. The other servants had fully accepted her as one of their own, and she found herself developing genuine friendships with Bridget, Anne, and Catherine. Yet there remained an undercurrent of longing that she couldn't quite suppress, a constant awareness of Lord Caspian that colored everything she did. She told herself it was gratitude, admiration for a good man in a position of power. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed while her roommates slept, she couldn't deny the truth. She was falling in love with him, hopelessly and foolishly, with a man so far above her station that even dreaming of anything more was absurd. She saw him regularly now, as her duties increasingly took her into parts of the manor where he worked and lived. Sometimes she would be cleaning a corridor when he passed, and he would nod to her with that slight smile that made her heart stutter. Once, when she was carrying a heavy bucket of water, he had stopped and taken it from her hands, without a word, carrying it to the kitchen himself before disappearing back to his study. The other servants had stared in shock. Lords didn't carry water buckets, but he had seemed to think nothing of it. It was about 6 weeks after her arrival that everything changed. Elara was in the great hall late one evening, polishing the pewter candlesticks that adorned the tables, when she heard raised voices from the corridor beyond. Curious despite herself, she moved closer to the doorway, and the words became clear. "You're being unreasonable, Caspian." It was Lady Ravenna's voice, shrill with frustration. "I've been patient, I've been understanding, but my patience has limits. Every other lord in the region would leap at the chance to marry me, to unite our lands, to benefit from my wealth and connections. Yet you continue to refuse me without even doing me the courtesy of explaining why." "I've explained repeatedly, Ravenna." Caspian's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I have no interest in marrying anyone, least of all someone who sees marriage purely as a political transaction. I don't love you. I don't even particularly like you. Your lands border mine, which necessitates a working relationship. But that's the extent of what I'm willing to offer." "Love." Ravenna spat the word like a curse. "What does love have to do with marriage among our class? Marriage is about power, alliances, heirs. Love is for peasants and fools." "Then I'm a fool," Caspian replied coldly, "because I won't marry without at least the possibility of love, of genuine partnership and respect. I did that once, Ravenna. I married for duty and politics, and it was a misery for both of us. My wife was trapped in a union with a man she didn't love, and I was bound to a woman I couldn't make happy no matter what I did. When she died birthing our child, I swore I would never put myself or another woman through that again." There was a long silence, and when Ravenna spoke again, her voice dripped with venom. "You're a sentimental fool, Caspian, and fools don't hold power long in this world. One day you'll realize you need allies more than you need your precious principles, and by then it will be too late. Don't come begging for my support when your idealism gets you killed." "I'll keep that in mind," Caspian said dryly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Your carriage will be ready to take you back to your own lands in the morning." Footsteps approached the doorway, and Elara barely had time to scramble back to her candlesticks before Lady Ravenna swept into the hall. The woman's face was twisted with rage, her carefully applied cosmetics unable to hide the ugly emotions beneath. She saw Elara and stopped, her dark eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You," Lady Ravenna hissed, stalking toward Elara with predatory grace. "You were listening to a private conversation. How dare you eavesdrop on your betters?" Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet the noblewoman's furious gaze without flinching. "I apologize, my lady. I was simply doing my work. I didn't mean to overhear." Didn't mean to, Ravenna repeated mockingly, circling Elara like a cat toying with a mouse. How convenient. Tell me, girl, what's your name? Elara, my lady. Elara, Ravenna said, tasting the name as if it were something distasteful. You're new here, aren't you? I haven't seen you before. Pretty little thing, in a common sort of way. Are you one of Lord Caspian's charity cases? He does love to collect broken things and try to fix them. The casual cruelty in her voice made Elara's hands clench around the cloth she'd been using to polish the candlesticks. She knew she should remain silent, should accept the abuse with downcast eyes and humble demeanor, as befitted a servant. But something in Ravenna's sneering superiority ignited a spark of defiance that had been building since the day her parents sold her. Lord Caspian is a good man, Elara said quietly but firmly. He treats people with dignity and respect, regardless of their station. That's not weakness or sentimentality. It's strength. Real strength. The kind that doesn't need to tear others down to feel powerful. Ravenna's face flushed an ugly red, and for a moment, Elara thought the woman might actually strike her. But before anything could happen, Caspian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Lady Ravenna, I believe your maid is waiting to help you pack for tomorrow's journey. He stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes held a warning that even Ravenna couldn't ignore. It would be unfortunate if you were delayed and forced to travel in the dark. Ravenna turned to face him, and Elara watched as the woman's expression shifted from rage to calculated charm with practiced ease. Of course, my lord. Though I do think you should discipline your servants more strictly. This one was quite rude. I'll address it, Caspian said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Good evening, Lady Ravenna. When the noblewoman had finally swept out of the hall in a rustle of expensive fabric and wounded pride, Caspian turned to Elara. She braced herself for the rebuke she undoubtedly deserved. Servants did not speak to nobility that way, regardless of provocation. But instead of anger, she saw something that looked almost like amusement in his eyes. That was either very brave or very foolish, he said, moving closer until he stood just a few feet away. I'm not entirely sure which. Foolish, my lord, Elara admitted, her earlier defiance crumbling now that the immediate threat had passed. I shouldn't have spoken to her that way. I apologize. If you need to dismiss me, I understand. Caspian shook his head, and now there was definitely amusement in his expression. Dismiss you? For defending my character against a woman who is insulting me? Hardly, though I would appreciate it if you could avoid antagonizing powerful nobles in the future. Lady Ravenna has a long memory and a vindictive nature. I'll try, my lord, Elara said, then added impulsively, though she deserved worse than what I said. Caspian laughed, a genuine sound of delight that transformed his usually serious face into something almost boyish. She did indeed. The woman has the sensitivity of a siege hammer and the charm of a tax collector. I've been trying to discourage her attentions for months, but she's remarkably persistent. They stood in silence for a moment, and Elara became acutely aware of how close he was, how she could see the flecks of lighter blue in his dark eyes, how his presence seemed to fill the space around her. She should excuse herself, return to her duties, maintain the proper distance between servant and lord, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor, and she couldn't quite bring herself to break this rare moment of connection. The candlesticks look very fine, Caspian said, gesturing to her abandoned work. You have a talent for bringing out the shine in things that have grown dull. Something in the way he said it made Elara wonder if he was talking about more than just pewter candlesticks. But before she could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and Martha appeared, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious disapproval. Elara, there you are. I need you in the kitchens immediately. We've got a problem with the stores. Mice have gotten into the grain sacks. She turned to Caspian with a respectful nod. My lord, my apologies for the interruption. No apology necessary, Martha. Go ahead, Elara. We'll speak more another time. As Elara followed Martha back to the kitchens, the older woman remained silent until they were well away from any potential listeners. Then she grabbed Elara's arm, her grip firm but not painful, and pulled her into a small storage room. What did I tell you? Martha demanded, her voice low and urgent. About guarding your heart? About the gap between servant and lord? I know, Elara whispered miserably. I'm trying, Martha. But he's a good man who treats you with kindness and respect, Martha interrupted. And that's made you imagine there could be something more. But there can't be, Elara, even if he cared for you, which I'm not saying he does. There's no future in it. Lords marry ladies. Servants marry servants. That's the way of the world, and no amount of wishing will change it. I know that, Elara said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. I'm not some foolish girl who thinks a lord is going to sweep me off my feet and make me his lady. I know my place, but knowing it and feeling it are two different things. Martha's expression softened slightly, and she released Elara's arm with a sigh. I understand, child, more than you know. When I was your age, I fancied myself in love with the young lord I served. This was before Lord Caspian's time, mind you, back when his uncle ruled these lands. Spent 2 years mooning over a man who barely knew I existed, breaking my heart a little more each day. Eventually, I realized I was wasting my life on an impossible dream, and married a good man from the village, a carpenter who loved me truly and gave me 20 happy years before fever took him. I'm sorry, Elara said softly. For your loss, as am I, Martha replied. But my point is this. There are good men in this world who would see you, truly see you, and value you for who you are. Don't waste your heart on someone you can never have when there might be someone perfect for you waiting just around the corner. Now come, let's deal with these mice before they eat through all our winter stores. The incident with Lady Ravenna seemed to mark a turning point of sorts. Ravenna departed the next morning with all the drama and wounded dignity she could muster, making thinly veiled threats about withdrawing her cooperation on various political matters. Caspian bid her farewell with perfect courtesy and obvious relief, and the entire household seemed to breathe easier once her carriage had disappeared down the road. The days grew shorter and colder as autumn deepened toward winter. The former members of the Brotherhood continued to integrate into their new lives, and the initial tensions had largely dissipated. Gareth proved himself an invaluable addition to the Guard, his experience and tactical knowledge earning the respect of even the most skeptical soldiers. Marcus, the hot-headed young man, had chosen farming over fighting and was working alongside an older farmer who had taken him under his wing like a son. Elara found herself thinking often about Martha's words, about the possibility of finding love with someone of her own station. Several of the young guards and male servants had begun showing interest in her now that she had filled out from regular meals, and her natural beauty was no longer hidden by hunger and worn clothing. There was William, one of the stable hands, who always smiled when he saw her and once brought her a bunch of late-blooming flowers. There was Thomas, not her father but a young guard who had been a farmer before joining Caspian's service, who engaged her in conversation whenever their paths crossed and made her laugh with his stories of mishaps during training. They were good men, kind men, and Elara tried to feel something for them beyond friendly appreciation, but her treacherous heart remained stubbornly fixated on the one man she could never have, the lord who treated her with respect and kindness, but could never see her as anything more than a servant he had saved from a cruel fate. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing heavy snows that blanketed the manor grounds and made travel treacherous. The household drew in upon itself, the long dark evenings filled with the tasks of maintaining warmth and preparing food for the increased number of mouths that now depended on Caspian's stores. Elara found herself working more closely with the other servants in the cramped warmth of the kitchens, and the forced intimacy of winter brought them all closer together. It was on one such evening, about 3 months after her arrival, that everything changed in a way Elara could never have anticipated. A blizzard had been raging for 2 days, making it impossible to venture outside except for the most essential tasks. The entire household was gathered in the great hall for the evening meal, servants and guards and nobles all eating together, as was Caspian's practice during harsh weather. The normal hierarchies relaxed in the face of nature's fury. Elara was serving at one of the lower tables when she heard the commotion at the main doors. Shouting, the stamp of booted feet, the clatter of weapons. Everyone turned as the doors burst open, admitting a blast of freezing wind and snow along with 3 figures wrapped in ice-crusted cloaks. The guards moved instantly to defensive positions, hands on sword hilts, but Caspian raised a hand to stay them. "Let them approach," he commanded, rising from his seat. "Anyone who travels in such weather must have urgent business indeed." The 3 figures stumbled forward, and as they pushed back their hoods, Elara felt her breath catch in her throat. The leader was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with graying blonde hair and a face marked by both beauty and hardship. She was dressed in fine clothing beneath her traveling cloak, though the garments were mud-stained and torn in places. Behind her were 2 guards, young men who looked exhausted and half-frozen. Lord Caspian, the woman said, her voice cultured despite her obvious distress. I am Lady Helena of Westmarch. I come seeking sanctuary for myself and my household. My lands have been attacked by Lord Brennan, the same Lord Brennan who sits at your council, who pretended friendship while plotting to seize my estates. My husband is dead, murdered by Brennan's men. My children are in hiding with loyal servants. I escaped only because my guard captain sacrificed himself to buy me time to flee. I have nowhere else to turn. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Lord Brennan was one of Caspian's allies, a powerful noble whose support was considered essential to maintaining peace in the region. If what this woman said was true, it would mean Caspian had been harboring a murderer and conspirator at his table. But it would also mean that offering her sanctuary would likely mean war with Brennan and his supporters. Caspian's face was unreadable as he studied the woman before him. Elara watched him, saw the way his mind was working through the implications, weighing options and consequences. This was the moment that would define what kind of lord he truly was. Would he choose political expediency and turn away this desperate woman, or would he stand by his principles regardless of the cost? Lady Helena, Caspian said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, you and your people are welcome in my house. You will have sanctuary here for as long as you need it, and if Lord Brennan has indeed committed the crimes you describe, he will answer for them. I don't shelter murderers at my table, regardless of their rank or the political consequences. Lady Helena's face crumpled with relief, and she sank into a deep curtsy despite her obvious exhaustion. Thank you, my lord. Thank you. I hoped, that you would be the one man in this region with the courage to stand against Brennan's tyranny. Martha, Caspian called, see that Lady Helena and her guards are given rooms, hot food, and whatever else they need. And send riders to Lord Brennan immediately. I want him here within 3 days to answer these accusations. If he's innocent, he'll come willingly. If he's guilty, well, we'll deal with that when the time comes. The hall erupted into activity as servants rushed to see to the unexpected guests, and guards began making plans for increased security. Elara found herself helping to prepare one of the guest chambers, stoking the fire high and bringing fresh linens and basins of hot water. As she worked, her mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. War was coming. She could feel it in the tension that gripped the manor, in the grim expressions of the guards as they checked their weapons and armor. Caspian had chosen principle over pragmatism, justice over political convenience, and that choice would have consequences that would ripple far beyond these walls. Later that night, as she made her way back to her quarters, Elara passed Caspian's study and saw light still burning beneath the door. On impulse, she knocked softly. There was a pause. Then his voice called for her to enter. He sat at his desk, surrounded by maps and documents, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression softened. Elara, it's late. You should be resting. So should you, my lord, she said, moving closer. You've been working since Lady Helena arrived. You need sleep. Sleep can wait, Caspian said, running a hand through his hair. I need to plan for what's coming. Brennan won't come peacefully if he's guilty, and even if he does, his allies might not accept my judgment. This could fracture the entire regional alliance. But you did the right thing, Elara said firmly. You gave sanctuary to a woman in desperate need. You stood by your principles. That's what makes you different from men like Brennan. You don't sacrifice your integrity for convenience. Caspian looked at her for a long moment, his intense blue eyes searching her face. You have remarkable faith in me. I hope I can live up to it. You will, Elara said with a conviction that surprised even herself. You already have, more times than you probably realize. You saved me from a fate worse than death. You gave Gareth and his men a chance at redemption when everyone else would have just hunted them down. And now you're protecting Lady Helena when it would be easier to turn her away. That's not just principle, my lord. That's courage. Caspian stood, moving around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. They were closer than propriety allowed, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct and concern, Elara reached up and placed her hand gently on his arm. You don't have to carry everything alone, she said softly. You have people who believe in you, who will stand with you no matter what comes. His hand covered hers, warm and strong, and for a breathless moment they simply stood there, connected by that touch. Elara's heart thundered in her chest, and she saw something in his eyes, something that looked like longing mixed with regret, that made her breath catch. "Elara," he said, her name a whisper on his lips. "You should go. It's not appropriate for you to be here alone with me like this, especially at this hour." "I know," she whispered back, but she didn't move. Neither did he. The space between them seemed charged with possibilities, with words unspoken and feelings barely contained. She knew she should step back, should return to her quarters and pretend this moment had never happened. But her feet remained rooted to the floor, her hand still resting on his arm, his hand still covering hers. The moment broke when footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. They stepped apart quickly, and by the time the door opened to admit Gareth, they were standing at a respectable distance, though Elara's heart still raced and her skin burned where Caspian had touched her. "My lord," Gareth said, his scarred face grim. "I've posted extra guards and sent scouts to watch the roads. If Brennan's planning to march on us, we'll have warning." He glanced at Elara with curiosity but said nothing about her presence. "Good," Caspian replied, his voice steady and commanding, giving no hint of what had just transpired. "Double the watch on the walls and make sure the armory is fully stocked. I want to be prepared for anything." Elara slipped out while the two men began discussing defensive strategies, her mind reeling from that brief moment of connection. She had felt it. She was sure she had. That flash of something more than lord to servant, more than gratitude or simple kindness. But what did it mean? And more importantly, what could it possibly lead to except heartbreak? The next 3 days passed in a state of heightened tension. Messengers rode out to Lord Brennan's estates, and the entire household waited for his response. Lady Helena recovered from her ordeal, and her story emerged in pieces. How Brennan had coveted her late husband's lands for years, how he had made increasingly aggressive offers to buy or trade for the property, how he had finally resorted to outright violence when diplomacy failed. Her husband, Lord Edmund, had been murdered in what Brennan tried to make look like a bandit attack, but Lady Helena had seen Brennan's men among the supposed bandits and knew the truth. On the morning of the third day, riders were spotted approaching the manor, but it wasn't Lord Brennan who arrived. It was his son, a young man of perhaps 25 years named Roland, accompanied by a small group of guards and an elderly man who appeared to be some kind of advisor or steward. Caspian received them in the great hall, with Lady Helena present as well, though she sat to the side with guards positioned protectively nearby. Elara was serving again, and she watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and dread. Roland was a handsome man with his father's height and strength, but with softer features and kinder eyes. He bowed respectfully to Caspian, his expression troubled rather than defiant. "Lord Caspian," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone bearing bad news, "I come with a confession and a plea for your judgment. My father, Lord Brennan, is guilty of the crimes Lady Helena has accused him of. He did order the attack on Lord Edmund's estate. He did murder a fellow nobleman to seize his lands, and he would have continued with this plan had I not discovered what he was doing and confronted him." A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled crowd. This was not what anyone had expected. The son turning against the father, admitting guilt rather than mounting a defense. "Continue," Caspian said, his face giving nothing away. Roland took a deep breath, and Elara could see the pain in his eyes. "When I learned what my father had done, I confronted him. He tried to justify it, said it was necessary for the security of our house, that Lord Edmund was weak, and his lands would be better managed under our control. I told him I would not be party to murder, that I would rather forfeit our lands than build my inheritance on blood. He became enraged, said I was a weak fool, that I wasn't fit to be his heir. We fought, and in his rage, his heart failed him. My father is dead, Lord Caspian. He died cursing me for my softness, for my unwillingness to do what he saw as necessary for power." Lady Helena made a small sound, something between satisfaction and grief. She had wanted justice for her husband, but this complicated things considerably. With Lord Brennan dead, who would answer for his crimes? "I come before you," Roland continued, "to offer restitution and to submit to your judgment. My father's crimes are my responsibility now. Lady Helena's lands will be restored to her immediately, along with compensation from our coffers for the damages and losses she suffered. and I place myself under your authority, Lord Caspian, to determine what further punishment is appropriate for my father's actions." Caspian studied the young man for a long moment, and Elara could almost see his mind working through the implications. This was unexpected, an honorable son trying to atone for a dishonorable father's crimes. It was the kind of complexity that simple justice couldn't easily address. "Lady Helena," Caspian said, turning to her, "you are the aggrieved party here. What would you have me do with Lord Roland?" Lady Helena rose from her seat, moving forward until she stood before Roland. She studied him with eyes that had seen too much pain, too much loss. "You are not your father," she said finally. "I can see that. And you've shown more courage and honor in admitting his guilt than he ever showed in his entire life. I do not seek vengeance against you, Lord Roland. Return my lands, return my husband's personal effects that were taken, and give me your word that you will rule your father's estates with justice and fairness. That will be recompense enough." Roland's eyes filled with tears, and he dropped to one knee before her. "You have my word, Lady Helena, and my deepest, most sincere apologies for the pain my father caused you. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the mercy you've shown me today." Caspian nodded approvingly. "Then it's settled. Lady Helena's lands will be restored. Compensation will be paid, and Lord Roland will take his father's place in our regional council, assuming he can govern with more wisdom and justice than his predecessor. This matter is closed." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "And perhaps this serves as a reminder to all of us that honor and integrity matter more than power or land. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stand against our own blood when they do wrong." The tension that had gripped the manor for 3 days dissipated like morning fog under the sun. There would be no war, no bloodshed, no fracturing of alliances. Instead, something remarkable had happened. Justice had been served through confession and restitution rather than violence, and a young lord had chosen to be better than his father. The household celebrated that night with a feast that, while not as elaborate as some of the formal dinners, was filled with genuine joy and relief. Elara found herself smiling as she worked, caught up in the infectious good spirits that filled the hall. She caught Caspian's eye across the room at one point, and he raised his goblet to her in a small, private salute that made her heart skip. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, William the stable hand approached Elara during a brief respite in her duties. He was a pleasant-looking young man with sandy hair and friendly brown eyes, and he'd been showing increasing interest in her over the past weeks. "Elara," he said, his nervousness evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. "I was wondering if you might like to walk with me tomorrow afternoon, when the weather's clear. I thought we could go down to the village, maybe stop by the market." Elara looked at him, this kind young man who was offering her exactly what Martha had suggested, a chance at a normal life with someone of her own station, someone who could give her companionship and perhaps even love. She should say yes. She should accept this opportunity and stop torturing herself over impossibilities. "William, she began, but before she could continue, a commotion at the main doors interrupted. Guards rushed in, supporting a man between them who was bleeding from multiple wounds and barely conscious. His clothing marked him as one of the scouts Gareth had sent out to watch the roads. "Bandits!" the scout gasped as he was lowered into a chair. "New group, not the Brotherhood. They've got a camp in the eastern forest, maybe 50 strong, and they're planning to raid the village tomorrow when everyone's at market. They think the manor's guard will be too far away to respond in time." The festive mood evaporated instantly. Caspian was on his feet immediately, his face transformed from relaxed host to commanding warrior in a heartbeat. "Gareth, assemble the guard, all of them, including the former Brotherhood members. Roland, if you and your men are willing, I could use your swords as well." "You have them," Roland said without hesitation, already moving toward the door. "My father may have been a murderer, but he trained me well in combat. Let me help you protect your people." Within minutes, the hall had cleared of fighting men, all rushing to prepare for battle. Elara stood frozen, watching Caspian as he strapped on his sword belt and issued rapid orders to his captains. This was war, real war, not political maneuvering or negotiations. Men would die tomorrow. Perhaps Caspian would die. The thought sent ice through her veins. Without thinking about propriety or consequences, she pushed through the crowd until she reached him. "My lord," she said, her voice urgent. "Please be careful. Don't—" She couldn't finish the sentence. couldn't voice the fear that gripped her heart. Caspian looked down at her, and something in his expression softened despite the battle readiness in his posture. "I will," he said quietly. Then, so softly that only she could hear, he added, "I have reasons to come back safely now. More reasons than I did before." Before she could process what he meant, he was gone, striding out of the hall with his guards around him. Elara stood alone in the suddenly empty space, her heart in her throat and tears pricking at her eyes. She had known, intellectually, that lords went to war, that men died fighting. But the reality of it, the possibility that Caspian might not return, was more terrifying than anything she had ever experienced. The night passed with agonizing slowness. Elara tried to sleep but couldn't, lying awake in her narrow bed while her roommates shifted restlessly around her. None of them could rest, not with their lord and so many of the guards riding out to face danger. Dawn came gray and cold, and Elara rose with the others to begin the day's work, though her mind was miles away in the eastern forest where Caspian and his men were preparing to face the bandits. Martha set them all to tasks that would keep their hands busy and their minds occupied, baking extra bread for when the men returned, preparing supplies for treating wounded, organizing the stores. But nothing could truly distract from the fear that hung over the household like a shroud. It was mid-afternoon when the first riders returned. Elara was in the courtyard when they arrived, and her heart leaped at the sight of the blue and silver livery. But then she saw the wounded men, the blood-soaked bandages, and her relief turned to renewed fear. Where was Caspian? Was he among the wounded? Was he— "Lord Caspian sends word," one of the riders called out. "The battle is won. The bandits are either captured or scattered. But there are many wounded who need tending, and Lord Caspian asks that we prepare rooms for them and send more supplies back with us." The household erupted into organized chaos as servants rushed to prepare for the wounded. Elara found herself helping to set up makeshift infirmaries in some of the larger rooms, laying out clean linens and filling basins with water. Her hands shook as she worked, fear and relief warring within her. The battle was won, but Caspian hadn't returned yet. What if he was among the wounded? What if— She forced herself to stop thinking and focus on the work. There would be time for fear later. Right now, people needed her help. The main party returned as the sun was setting, a long column of riders and walking wounded making their way through the manor gates. Elara stood with the other servants in the courtyard, her eyes scanning desperately for one particular face. She saw Gareth, bloodied but grinning triumphantly. She saw Roland, helping support an injured guard. She saw the former Brotherhood members, some wounded but all alive. But she didn't see— There, at the head of the column, tall and commanding despite the exhaustion evident in his posture, rode Caspian. His armor was dented and splattered with blood, whether his own or others. Elara couldn't tell from this distance, but he sat his horse with the same easy grace he always had. He was alive. He was safe. The relief that flooded through Elara was so intense it made her knees weak. He dismounted in the courtyard, and immediately Martha was there, fussing over him like a mother hen despite his protests that others needed attention more than he did. But as he turned to address his household, to thank them for their preparations, and reassure them that the danger had passed, his eyes found Elara's across the crowded courtyard. And in that gaze, she saw something that made her heart stop, and then race. A warmth, a connection, an acknowledgement of something between them that went far beyond lord and servant. The following days were filled with tending to the wounded and celebrating the victory. The bandits who had survived the battle and been captured were given the same choice Caspian had offered the Brotherhood: swear loyalty and find honest work, or face justice for their crimes. Most chose redemption, though a handful refused and were imprisoned to await trial. The village that had been targeted sent representatives to thank Lord Caspian personally, bringing gifts of food and handcrafted goods that they could barely afford, but insisted on presenting as tokens of their gratitude. Through it all, Elara found herself increasingly aware of Caspian's presence, and more disturbingly, of his awareness of her. Their eyes would meet across crowded rooms, and that connection she had felt in his study seemed to grow stronger rather than fading. He began finding excuses to speak with her, asking her opinion on the best way to arrange flowers in the Great Hall, requesting that she personally serve at smaller dinners with visiting dignitaries, praising her work in ways that made the other servants exchange knowing glances. Martha noticed, of course. Martha noticed everything. But instead of the stern warnings Elara expected, the older woman simply watched with a troubled expression, as if she were witnessing something she both feared and hoped for in equal measure. It was perhaps 2 weeks after the battle when everything came to a head. Elara was in the manor's small chapel late one evening, lighting candles and straightening the prayer cushions as was her duty. The space was peaceful, lit only by flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the stone walls and simple wooden altar. She had always found comfort in this quiet sanctuary, even though her faith had been tested by the hardships she'd endured. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't hear anyone enter until a voice spoke from the shadows near the door. "I've been looking for you." Elara spun around to find Caspian standing there, still dressed in his everyday clothing, rather than the formal attire he wore for public appearances. He looked tired, she thought, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. There was something in his expression that made her heart race with a mixture of hope and fear. "My lord," she said, dropping into a curtsy. "I was just finishing my duties here. I can leave if you wish to pray in private." "Don't go," he said quickly, moving closer. "Please, I need to speak with you, and this may be the only place where we won't be interrupted or observed." Elara's mouth went dry. This was dangerous, being alone with him in such an isolated place, especially when there was this tension between them that grew stronger every day. But she couldn't make herself leave, couldn't walk away from whatever he needed to say. "What did you wish to speak about, my lord?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Caspian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had learned to recognize. "I don't even know where to begin. This goes against everything I know about proper conduct between lord and servant, everything I've been taught about maintaining appropriate boundaries." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "But I can't continue pretending I don't feel what I feel, that there isn't something between us that grows stronger every day despite all reason and propriety." Elara's heart hammered so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "My lord, I don't understand." "Yes, you do," he interrupted gently. "You feel it too. I see it in your eyes when you look at me, in the way you respond when we speak. There's a connection between us, Elara. Something I've never felt with anyone else, not even with my late wife, whom I was supposed to love." He moved closer, until he stood just an arm's length away. "I know this is madness. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this cannot and should not be, but I find I don't care about any of them anymore." "What are you saying?" Elara whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'm saying that I care for you," Caspian said, his deep voice rough with emotion. "More than care. I've fallen in love with you, Elara. With your courage and your kindness, with the way you defended me to Lady Ravenna despite the risk to yourself, with the strength you've shown in rebuilding your life after such betrayal. You're everything I never knew I wanted, everything I thought I'd never find." Tears spilled down Elara's cheeks and she didn't try to stop them. "I love you too," she admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush of relief and joy and terror. "I've tried not to. Tried to guard my heart as Martha advised, but I couldn't help it. You're the first person who ever made me feel like I had value beyond my ability to bear children, who saw me as a complete person rather than a defective woman. But my lord, Caspian, this cannot lead anywhere good. You're a lord. I'm a servant. The world will never accept. Then the world will have to adjust," Caspian said firmly. He reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks, his touch achingly tender. "I've spent my entire life doing what was expected, what was proper, what would maintain stability and order. I married a woman I didn't love because it was politically advantageous. I watched her grow more miserable every day, knowing I was the cause of her unhappiness because I couldn't give her the love she deserved. When she died, I swore I would never again trap myself or another person in a loveless union. I would rather remain unmarried forever than repeat that mistake. But I can't give you children," Elara said, voicing the fear that had haunted her since the moment she realized her feelings for him. "I can't give you heirs. What kind of lady would I be who couldn't even fulfill the most basic duty of a wife?" Caspian's hands moved to cup her face, tilting it up so she had to meet his intense gaze. "You are not defined by your inability to bear children, Elara. You have so much more to offer. Intelligence, compassion, strength of character. And as for heirs, there are ways. I have cousins who could inherit if needed, or we could adopt children in need of homes. The world is full of orphans who would thrive under our care. This is not an insurmountable obstacle. But your people, the other nobles, they'll never accept a servant as your lady. They'll think you've gone mad, that I've somehow enchanted you or manipulated you. Lady Ravenna will spread such rumors about me. Elara's voice broke, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Let them think what they want, Caspian said fiercely. I don't govern for the approval of other nobles or to maintain some facade of propriety. I govern to create justice and protect my people. And you, Elara, you would be a far better lady than most of the noble women I've met. You understand suffering because you've experienced it. You have compassion for the weak because you've been weak. You would be a true partner, not just an ornament to display at court functions. He drew her closer, and Elara found herself pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. This was real. This was happening. The man she loved, the Lord who had saved her from a terrible fate, was telling her that he loved her too, that he wanted to make her his lady despite every obstacle society would place in their path. I'm terrified, she whispered against his chest. I'm terrified of hoping for this, of believing it's possible, only to have it torn away. I know, Caspian murmured into her hair. I'm terrified too. But I've learned that the greatest courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite fear because something is worth fighting for. You're worth fighting for, Elara. We're worth fighting for. He tilted her face up and kissed her then, gentle and reverent, a kiss that tasted of possibility and promise. Elara's hands fisted in his tunic as she kissed him back, pouring all the love and longing she had been suppressing for months into that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, she saw the same wonder in his eyes that she felt in her heart. We'll have to be careful, Caspian said, his forehead resting against hers. We'll need to prepare the household to make sure people understand that this isn't some passing fancy or inappropriate dalliance. I want to do this properly, Elara. I want to court you openly, to give you time to be certain this is what you want before we make any formal announcements. How long? Elara asked, already dreading the time they would have to hide their feelings to maintain pretenses. A few months, perhaps, Caspian said thoughtfully. Enough time for people to see us together in various contexts, to understand that this is based on genuine affection and respect rather than mere physical attraction. And there are practicalities to address. You'll need education in the duties of a lady, training in the management of a household this size, instruction in the political complexities you'll need to navigate. The enormity of what he was proposing began to sink in. Elara wouldn't just be marrying him. She would be taking on responsibilities she had never imagined, learning to move in circles where one wrong word or action could have serious consequences. The thought was daunting, but as she looked into Caspian's eyes and saw the absolute confidence he had in her, she felt her own courage rising to meet the challenge. I'll learn, she said firmly. Whatever I need to know, whatever I need to become, I'll learn it. I won't shame you or let you down. You could never shame me, Caspian said, pulling her close again. You're the bravest person I know, Elara. You've survived betrayal and hardship that would have broken weaker souls, and you've done it with grace and dignity. You're already everything I need you to be. The rest is just details. They stood together in the quiet chapel, wrapped in each other's arms, until the candles began to burn low, and they knew they had to return to their respective roles before someone came looking for them. But as Elara finally made her way back to her quarters, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She had a future now, a real future, with the man she loved. It wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles and opposition, judgment and gossip, but they would face it together. The next morning, Caspian called Martha to his study and informed her of his intentions. The older woman's reaction was complicated, surprise warring with resignation, concern mixing with cautious approval. I had hoped you'd have more sense than this, Martha said bluntly, her hands planted on her hips as she faced her lord. But I suppose when the heart wants what it wants, sense has little to do with it. The girl loves you truly. I can see that. And you love her, which frankly astonishes me given how carefully you've guarded your heart all these years. But my lord, the road ahead will be difficult. There will be nobles who refuse to accept her, servants who will be jealous or resentful, challenges you can't even anticipate yet. I know, Caspian acknowledged. That's why I need your help, Martha. Elara will need guidance. someone to teach her what she needs to know without making her feel inadequate or overwhelmed. You've been managing this household for decades. You understand the complexities better than anyone. Will you help her? Martha studied him for a long moment, then sighed deeply. Of course I'll help her. The girl's got a good heart and a strong spirit. She'll need both for what's ahead. But I'm going to be honest with both of you about the challenges, and I expect you to listen when I warn you about potential problems. Agreed, Caspian said, relief evident in his expression. Thank you, Martha. I know this isn't what you wanted. What I wanted doesn't matter, Martha interrupted. What matters is that you're both happy and that this household continues to run smoothly, despite whatever scandals may arise. Now, when do you want to begin Elara's training? The sooner she starts learning, the better prepared she'll be when you make your formal announcement. And so began the strangest period of Elara's life. By day, she continued her regular duties as a servant, but Martha began carving out time for private lessons, teaching her the intricacies of managing a large household, instructing her in proper etiquette for dealing with nobles, drilling her on the political relationships between various families and factions. It was exhausting and often frustrating, as Elara struggled to remember which fork to use for which course, or how to navigate the complex hierarchies of noble society. But she persevered, driven by love and determination in equal measure. Caspian helped when he could, spending evenings with her in his study, teaching her to read and write with greater skill, explaining the economic and political realities that shaped his decisions as lord. They were careful to maintain propriety when others were present, but in those private moments, they allowed themselves small gestures of affection, a hand held briefly, a gentle touch on the shoulder, looks that spoke volumes. The household began to notice, of course. Servants gossiped about the time Lord Caspian spent with Elara, about the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. Some were supportive, particularly those like Bridget and Catherine who had become Elara's friends. Others were jealous or disapproving, muttering that she was getting above her station, that she would bring shame on them all. 3 months passed in this strange liminal state, with Elara caught between two worlds, neither fully servant nor lady, but something in between. The winter began to release its grip on the land, and the first tentative signs of spring appeared in the form of snowdrops pushing through the frozen earth, and longer days that brought hints of warmth. With the changing season came a shift in the household's atmosphere as well. What had begun as whispered speculation about Lord Caspian's relationship with Elara had evolved into something approaching acceptance, at least among those who knew them both well. The turning point came on a crisp morning in early spring when Lady Helena, who had remained at the manor as Caspian's guest while her own estates were being restored, sought out Elara in the kitchens. The noblewoman had largely kept to herself during her stay, grieving her husband and planning her return home, but she had observed the dynamics of the household with keen eyes. "Elara," Lady Helena said, her voice kind but direct, "walk with me in the garden. I wish to speak with you privately." Elara's heart hammered with anxiety as she accompanied the lady outside. The gardens were just beginning to wake from winter's sleep, the bare branches showing the first green buds of new growth. They walked in silence for a few moments before Lady Helena spoke. "I'm returning to my lands next week," she said. "My steward has sent word that the repairs are complete and my children are eager to come home. But before I go, I wanted to tell you something that I think you need to hear." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I know what it's like to be judged for circumstances beyond your control. When my husband and I married, I was already considered too old by society's standards. I was nearly 30, well past the age when most noble women wed. There were whispers that I was barren, that I was damaged goods, that Lord Edmund was foolish to take me as his wife." Elara looked at the older woman with new understanding, seeing the pain of old wounds in her eyes. "But Edmund didn't care about the gossip," Lady Helena continued. "He loved me for who I was, not for what I could give him. And do you know what happened? We were blessed with 3 beautiful children, proving all the gossips wrong. But even if we hadn't been, even if I truly had been barren, Edmund would have loved me just the same. That's what real love is, Elara. Choosing someone despite what the world says, despite the obstacles, despite everything. Why are you telling me this?" Elara asked softly, though she thought she knew. "Because I've watched you and Lord Caspian these past months," Lady Helena replied. "I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, the way his entire demeanor softens when you enter a room, and I've seen the way you look at him With love, yes, but also with fear that you're not worthy of that love. So I'm telling you this as someone who has walked a similar path. You are worthy. Your worth isn't determined by your ability to bear children, or by your birth, or by what anyone else thinks. It's determined by the content of your character, and from what I've observed, your character is exceptional. Tears pricked at Elara's eyes. Thank you, my lady. Your words mean more than you know. There's one more thing, Lady Helena said, stopping to face Elara directly. When Lord Caspian announces his intention to marry you, and I believe he will, sooner rather than later, there will be opposition. Some nobles will refuse to accept you out of pride or prejudice, but others, like myself and like Lord Roland, will support you. You won't face this alone, Elara. You'll have allies who understand that true nobility lies in one's actions, not one's bloodline. That evening, as Elara was preparing for bed, Bridget pulled her aside with barely contained excitement. There's to be a gathering tomorrow, she whispered. All the household staff and guards, called to the great hall after the morning meal. Lord Caspian wants to make an announcement. Elara, do you think, could it be? Elara's heart began to race. They had discussed waiting longer, allowing more time for people to adjust to the idea of them together. But perhaps Caspian had decided that enough time had passed, that the moment had come to make their relationship official. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She barely slept that night, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. What if the household rejected the announcement? What if Caspian changed his mind at the last moment? What if she wasn't ready for this leap from servant to lady? But beneath the anxiety was a core of certainty. She loved Caspian, and he loved her, and together they could face whatever challenges arose. The great hall was packed the next morning, every servant and guard crowding in to hear what their lord had to say. Elara stood near the back with the other household servants, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. Martha stood beside her, and the older woman reached over to give her hand a brief, reassuring squeeze. Caspian entered with his usual commanding presence, but Elara could see the slight tension in his shoulders that betrayed his own nervousness. He climbed onto a raised platform so everyone could see him clearly, and the hall fell silent. Thank you all for gathering, Caspian began, his deep voice carrying easily across the crowded space. I have an announcement to make that will affect this entire household, and I wanted you all to hear it from me directly, rather than through gossip and speculation. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Elara's. Many of you have noticed that I've been spending considerable time with Elara, one of our kitchen servants. Some of you have speculated about the nature of our relationship, and I'm here today to confirm what many have suspected. Elara and I have fallen in love. A ripple of shock and excitement moved through the assembled crowd, though most seemed more surprised by the public confirmation than by the news itself. Caspian continued, his voice steady and firm. I know this is unconventional. I know it breaks with tradition and propriety. A lord is supposed to marry a lady of appropriate rank, to form political alliances and produce heirs to continue his line. But I've learned something in my years as lord of these lands, that the rules we follow should serve justice and human happiness, not the other way around. Elara has proven herself to be intelligent, compassionate, strong, and capable. She will make an excellent lady of this manor, and I intend to marry her with or without society's approval. He descended from the platform and walked through the crowd, which parted before him like water, until he stood directly in front of Elara. He took her hand in his, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that betrayed how much this moment meant to him. Elara, he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, but with his eyes locked on hers alone. I know we've discussed this privately, but I want to ask you properly before all these witnesses. Will you marry me? Will you take on the burden and privilege of being my wife, my partner, my lady? I promise you it won't always be easy. But I also promise that I will love you and stand beside you through whatever challenges we face. Elara was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked up at the man who had saved her from despair and given her a future she had never dared to dream of. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll be your wife and your partner and whatever else you need me to be. I love you, Caspian. The hall erupted in a mixture of cheers and shocked exclamations. Caspian pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the household reacted around them. When they finally separated, Elara could see tears on his own cheeks, though he made no move to hide them. Gareth was the first to step forward, his scarred face split in a wide grin. "Well, my lord, I've seen you do many brave things, but this might be the bravest yet. Congratulations to you both." He bowed to Elara with genuine respect. "My lady," and I use that title with full sincerity, "you've captured the heart of the best man I know. Treat it well." "I will," Elara promised, her voice still thick with tears. "I swear it." Roland came forward next, having been present for the announcement as he had become a frequent visitor to the manor over the past months. "Lord Caspian, you continue to teach me what true nobility looks like. And Elara, I would be honored to stand witness at your wedding, if you'll have me." One by one, the members of the household came forward to offer their congratulations, or, in some cases, their quiet reservations. Most were genuinely happy, swept up in the romantic nature of the story. The lord who fell in love with a servant, the girl sold by her family who found her true value. But Elara could see disapproval on some faces, resentment in some eyes. This would not be universally accepted, just as Lady Helena had warned. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and adjustment. Word of Caspian's engagement spread rapidly throughout the region, generating reactions that ranged from delighted support to outraged condemnation. Several noble families sent letters expressing their shock and disapproval, including one particularly venomous missive from Lady Ravenna that questioned both Caspian's sanity and Elara's morality. Caspian read it aloud to Elara one evening, then tossed it into the fire with a satisfied smile. "Ravenna's opinion matters less than nothing to me," he said, pulling Elara close. "Let her rage and scheme. She has no power here." But not all the opposition came from outside. Within the household, tensions arose as some of the servants struggled to adjust to Elara's changing status. She was no longer truly one of them, but neither was she yet the lady of the manor. She existed in an uncomfortable middle ground that bred resentment in those who had served longer or believed themselves more deserving of advancement. The situation came to a head about a month after the announcement, when Elara overheard two of the laundry maids talking in the corridor outside the kitchens. "She's gotten too big for her britches," one was saying, her voice sharp with spite. "Acts like she's already lady of the manor, ordering us about. She's still just a servant, barren and worthless, who got lucky that the Lord took pity on her. Mark my words, once he realizes what a mistake he's made, she'll be right back where she started." The words stung, cutting deep into the insecurities Elara had tried so hard to overcome. But before she could respond or simply walk away, Martha's voice cracked through the corridor like a whip. "That's quite enough of that." The head cook emerged from the kitchens, her face stern with disapproval. "Elara has done nothing to deserve such vicious gossip. She works hard, treats everyone with respect, and has never lorded her changing status over anyone. If you have complaints about her behavior, bring them to me directly. But I'll not tolerate this kind of poisonous talk in my household. Is that understood?" The two maids scurried away, properly chastened, and Martha turned to Elara with a sympathetic expression. "Don't let them get to you, child. Jealousy makes people ugly, and there will always be those who can't stand to see others rise above their station. You just keep being yourself, kind, hard-working, honest. Those who matter will see your true character." "Thank you, Martha," Elara said, blinking back tears. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Well, you won't have to find out," Martha replied gruffly. "Now come, we have the menu for your wedding feast to finalize. And I warn you, I have very strong opinions about the proper way to roast a pig." The wedding preparations consumed the next 2 months. Elara found herself overwhelmed by the sheer number of decisions that needed to be made. The guest list, the menu, the decorations, her dress, the ceremony itself. Lady Helena returned to help, bringing her daughters with her, and their presence provided both practical assistance and emotional support. The eldest daughter, a girl of 16 named Margaret, took to Elara immediately, declaring that the romance was just like the stories the bards sing about. Caspian's seamstress was commissioned to create Elara's wedding dress, and the woman outdid herself. The gown was made of deep blue silk, the color of Caspian's house, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that caught the light. It was simpler than what a noble-born bride might wear, but far more elegant than anything Elara had ever imagined wearing. When she tried it on for the first time, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her from the polished metal mirror. "You look like a queen," Catherine breathed, her eyes wide with admiration. Bridget and Anne nodded in agreement, and even Martha's stern face softened with approval. "You look like yourself," Caspian said from the doorway, and everyone turned to find him standing there despite the tradition that the groom shouldn't see the dress before the wedding. "You look like the woman I fell in love with, only now the outside finally matches the beauty I've always seen on the inside." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the last traces of winter finally surrendering to spring's warm embrace. The ceremony was held in the manor's chapel, which had been decorated with branches of flowering trees and bunches of early wildflowers. The guest list was relatively small by noble standards. Those lords and ladies who had proven themselves true friends, the household staff, representatives from the villages under Caspian's protection, Gareth and the former members of the Brotherhood who had proven their loyalty, and Roland with several other young nobles who represented a new generation more willing to accept change. Elara walked down the aisle on Martha's arm, as the older woman had become more mother to her than her own had ever been. Her birth family had not been invited, and Elara felt no regret at their absence. The people gathered in this chapel were her real family now, those who had accepted her, supported her, believed in her worth when she had struggled to believe in it herself. Caspian waited at the altar, dressed in formal attire of midnight blue and silver, and the look on his face when he saw her made Elara's breath catch. It was a look of pure love and wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, that this moment was actually happening. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of words and rituals. Elara spoke her vows with a steady voice, promising to love and honor Caspian for all her days, to stand beside him in times of joy and hardship, to be a true partner in all things. When Caspian spoke his own vows, his deep voice was thick with emotion, and Elara saw tears shining in his eyes as he pledged himself to her. "I take you as my wife, my partner, my equal," he said, holding her hands tightly in his. "Not because of your birth or your ability to bear children or anything else society might value, but because of who you are, the woman who survived betrayal and hardship with grace, who defended my honor when it would have been safer to stay silent, who has shown me what love truly means. I promise to treasure you, protect you, and build a life with you that honors us both." When the priest finally declared them married and Caspian kissed her, the chapel erupted in cheers and applause. Elara clung to her husband, and felt joy so intense it was almost painful flooding through her. This was real. This was her life now. She was no longer Elara the baron's servant, sold by her family and valued by no one. She was Elara, lady of this manor, wife to a man she loved desperately and valued for exactly who she was. The feast that followed was magnificent, with food and drink flowing freely, and entertainment provided by musicians and performers Caspian had hired from the nearby city. Nobles mingled with servants, former bandits laughed with guards, and the rigid hierarchies of society seemed temporarily suspended in favor of genuine celebration. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed more freely, Gareth stood to offer a toast. "To Lord Caspian and Lady Elara," he called out, raising his goblet high. "May your love be as strong as your convictions. May your partnership weather any storm, and may you continue to show us all what real courage looks like. You've proven that the measure of a person lies not in their birth, but in their character, and that true nobility comes from the heart, not from a title. To the happy couple. To the happy couple." The assembled guests echoed, and Elara found herself crying again. Happy tears this time. Tears of joy and gratitude and overwhelming relief that she had found her place in the world after all. Late that night, after the guests had finally departed or retired to their chambers, Caspian led Elara up to the lord's quarters. Their quarters now, she realized with a start. The rooms were spacious and beautifully appointed, with a large bed covered in rich furs and fine linens, a fireplace that filled the space with warmth, and windows that overlooked the manor grounds. "Are you happy?" Caspian asked, taking her hands in his as they stood by the window, looking out at the moon-washed landscape. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Elara replied honestly. 6 months ago, I was being sold by my parents like livestock, convinced I was worthless because I couldn't bear children. Now I'm married to the most incredible man I've ever known. I'm lady of a great house, and I have a future full of purpose and meaning. It's like living in a dream." "It's not a dream," Caspian assured her, pulling her close. "It's real and it's ours. And yes, there will be challenges ahead. Nobles who refuse to accept you, political complications, people who will never understand or approve of our choices. But we'll face all of it together, as partners. That's what marriage is supposed to be. Two people choosing each other every day, building something stronger than either could build alone. I choose you, Elara said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. Every day for the rest of my life. I choose you. And I choose you, Caspian replied, then kissed her with a passion and tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future bright with possibility. In the months and years that followed, Elara proved herself to be everything Caspian had believed she could be. She learned the intricacies of managing the household and eventually took over many of those duties from Martha, freeing the older woman to finally retire with honor and comfort. She became involved in the governance of the villages, using her own experiences of poverty and hardship to understand the struggles of common people in ways most nobles never could. She worked alongside Lady Helena to establish a sanctuary for women fleeing abusive situations, offering them the same chance at redemption and new life that she herself had been given. The question of heirs was resolved when Elara and Caspian adopted 3 orphan children from the villages, 2 boys and a girl who had lost their parents to disease and had been living in desperate circumstances. The children flourished under their care, and though Caspian ensured his cousin remained designated as official heir to maintain political stability, everyone knew the adopted children would inherit significant holdings and responsibilities. They were loved fiercely by both their adoptive parents and treated no differently than if they had been born to the marriage. Some nobles never accepted Elara, refused to attend gatherings where she would be present, whispered that Caspian had lost his mind or been bewitched. But others followed Caspian and Roland's example, beginning to look at character and capability rather than just bloodline when choosing marriage partners and allies. Slowly, incrementally, the rigid hierarchies that had defined society for generations began to shift, and Elara found herself at the center of a quiet revolution. Gareth remained captain of the guard until age forced him to retire, at which point he took up residence in a cottage on the manor grounds where he spent his days teaching weapons skills to young recruits and telling stories of the old days. Marcus, the former bandit who had chosen farming, married a village girl and had 6 children who grew up never knowing that their father had once been an outlaw. William the stable hand married Catherine, and they remained lifelong friends with Elara and Caspian. Martha lived to see Elara firmly established as lady of the manor, respected even by those who had initially scorned her, before passing peacefully in her sleep one winter night. At her funeral, Elara spoke of how the older woman had been more mother to her than her own, how Martha's gruff kindness and unwavering support had made all the difference during those difficult early months. The entire household mourned her loss, but celebrated a life well lived in service to others. As for Elara's birth family, she never saw them again. She heard occasionally through village gossip that her father had drunk away the silver coins within a year, that her brothers had married poorly and struggled to keep their farm running, that her mother had grown bitter and old before her time. Part of Elara grieved for them, for the family that could have been if they had chosen love over pragmatism, but a larger part recognized that their choices had inadvertently given her the life she was meant to live, and she found a measure of peace in that understanding. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as Elara and Caspian stood together on the manor walls watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, leaning against his side. "Marrying me instead of someone who could have brought you political advantages and legitimate heirs?" Caspian pulled her closer, his arm strong and secure around her waist. "Never, not for a single moment. You've given me everything I could have asked for, and so much more that I didn't even know I needed. You've made me a better man, a better lord, a better person. Our children adore you. Our people respect you, and I love you more with each passing year. What more could any man want?" "I love you too," Elara said, tears of joy and gratitude pricking at her eyes even after all these years. "Thank you for seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for giving me this life, this family, this purpose." "You gave yourself those things," Caspian corrected gently. "I just provided the opportunity. You're the one who seized it, who worked hard and persevered and refused to let anyone, including yourself, tell you that you were less than you are. You're remarkable, Elara. You always have been. As the sun sank below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Elara reflected on the truth of Martha's long-ago words. There were indeed worse fates than being unable to bear children. And sometimes, what seemed like the worst thing that could happen turned out to be the gateway to something far better than anything you had dared to dream. Her infertility, which had once defined her as worthless in the eyes of her family and village, had ultimately led her to a man who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. And together, they had built a life of meaning, purpose, and genuine love that would have been impossible if she had followed the conventional path. She was no longer Elara the barren servant, sold because she was deemed defective. She was Lady Elara, wife to Lord Caspian, mother to 3 beloved children, champion of the vulnerable, and living proof that worth is not determined by circumstances of birth or body, but by the choices we make and the love we give. And as she stood in her husband's arms, watching the first stars emerge in the twilight sky, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged, and that she was at last truly home.